Take your water, please. Yeah.
No one is leaving here until I leave, Beamer.
So the budget is balanced.
No one. I will save the last question for you. Yeah. I will save the.
What are you gonna do?
I see the, yeah, right. Yeah, take your pension. I see the light is on, so we will get rolling. So, welcome to May 23rd budget session. And Mr. City Manager, take it away.
All right. Well, thank you, Mr. Mayor, and thanks everybody for coming tonight. It's good to have you. I appreciate all of our staff being here as well.
Yes.
It's always nice to have these folks around us and ready to help out. This is the official delivery of your fiscal year 24 budget. And without a doubt, we've put together a couple tools that I hope will help you as you navigate the larger budget document that looks generally like this. We try to condense it in something that looks more like this. And that narrative that you have in front of you, reduces it even further to try to give you some of the major highlights that the fiscal year 24 budget proposes. So, I wouldn't say the narrative is encyclopedic by any means with regard to what you could find in your budget document itself, but I do think it's a pretty good review of some of the larger things that we're concerned about, some larger things that we're gonna talk in more detail about tonight, and serves as a pretty good script as it relates to getting through something like this. The thing that I find incredible every time we go through this as a staff team and when we come to you, we really do scrub all these numbers. We go through every number that these two books contain. And that might be hard to believe, but I'm telling you, that's what happens. And some have described it in a little more colorful terms than I would to you tonight as far as that process goes, but it really is a good process and helpful, and what we will try to do this evening is boil down, again, a lot of the major tenets, themes, questions for you to discuss, but if you have any questions at all, nothing's really off limits, and that's why we've got everybody here tonight to kind of help us through a lot of this, because I really couldn't do it all myself, I'll tell you that, to try to answer all those questions that this contains. And in that regard, I definitely want to thank everybody that helped put this together. Every one of the folks in this room, a lot of their teammates, finance team, a lot of good work from your staff that I'm fortunate to be a part of. So thank you for that opportunity, but also thanks to everybody here to put all this together. It's a body of work. It's a heavy lift. And I hope you'll feel good about what it is that we share with you for the next couple days. Tonight is really just straight budget discussion and delivery. We're anticipating that if we have any homework or additional information you might need that we aren't quite on tap to provide, tomorrow night will give us that opportunity to follow up with you on any number of those questions that we may need to follow up on. But we also have a series of other topics that we need to cover as well, the likes of which would imply a lot of additional budget direction also. So
Tomorrow night,
yes. Be mindful of that. We're going to need you both nights and try to move the needle quite a bit from here on out. So if it's okay, I'll go ahead and approach the screen here and try to work from that end of the room, mostly so I can see better. But that way you can also see me as well. Thank you, Michael, Council Burr. Apologize for that. So one of the biggest discussions that we have every year, let's go ahead and hit the first slide if we could, is with respect to whether or not the budget is balanced. And I really wouldn't want to bring you a budget that is not balanced. Certainly when you talk about a lot of the technicalities with respect to balancing a budget, that generally means to me that I'm not going to bring a budget to you that relies operationally on reserves to balance said budget, if you will. Now, you and I know, however, that we use savings accounts and so on to do a lot of capital. And so from that perspective, capital is definitely drawing upon those savings accounts that we've developed over the years. But nonetheless, again, we really don't present a capital budget that doesn't have the cash available to do each of those projects. And so that is a really important tenet of what it is that we present to you every year, as sort of a feature of the pandemic period that we were able to make that shift. You're not going to get a capital budget that doesn't have dollars behind it to make all those projects happen. So that's what I mean by a balanced budget. And I think that's something that you can feel good about, I hope, as it relates to the opportunity that you have typically to talk to your constituents and everything else. Undoubtedly, when you do, if we could hit the next slide, you will likely hear something along these lines from some of your constituents. And the only reason I say that is because that's generally what I hear. When budgets are delivered and talked about in public and that kind of thing. And I'm here to tell you that, just like we have entitled the slide, that really is a myth. Generally speaking, as you will soon see, we are not basing any of our projections or prognostications or whatever on anything that we don't think isn't conservative or within sight or within a really reasonable set of data that guides us in the directions that we're going to discuss. Okay. One of the things that
Do you mind if we take questions as we're going?
Absolutely not.
Okay, let's do
Absolutely
that.
not.
Mr. Cameron?
Sorry, I hate to start
No,
off
it's quite all
early.
right.
You hardly got through your introduction. Is this going to be made available to us, this slide deck?
We certainly can. Absolutely.
I would
Yeah.
like it.
Yeah,
Thank you.
yeah,
That way I
we'll
don't have
email
to
it
take
to all
notes
of
on
you.
this.
I do want to ask you a question while you're on the
Yes, sir.
subject. And I'm assuming that everything that's been budgeted in our capital budget is not going to be seen through, or some of it even started next fiscal year. Is that true? You certainly don't anticipate that everything that is in our capital budget for this next fiscal year will be done within that year. Is that true?
Mayor, I think that's a fair question, and what I would say is, at the very least, we really hope to get at least started on the projects that we're presenting to you tonight.
And I know we've ran into this before, especially with, in Andrew's department. And so I was going to ask, why did we bother even budgeting them unless we are literally going to get everything that's in there started at least during this next fiscal year? So.
And that is basically our benchmark. If we plan on going to bid, if we plan on even starting with any of the preliminary contracts, statute actually requires that we have those dollars set apart and ready to go and budgeted, even if we don't make, remarkable progress with every single project.
Fair enough.
So I appreciate that. Thank you. Good question. Indeed, we are talking about a $31 million budget proposal over last year's budget. So in other words, last year's budget, when we came to you this time last year, was roughly $167 million. This year, we're talking about a $197 million budget. And I'm obviously speaking in, rounded numbers, if you will. So that's roughly a $30 million increase for the casual observer, right? The reality is, a lot of that $30 million is tied up in capital. For example, when we pull money out of a savings account and we put it into the project fund that is necessary to facilitate whatever capital initiative we have in mind or that we bring to you to consider, that is actually considered an expense and a revenue. even though all we're doing is shifting money from a savings account to a, kind of a facilitating account. It's considered an expense and a revenue. And so that, attributes to a lot of that $31 million. And so the reality is, if you wanted to bring that number down, the biggest spot that you would get the most bang for your buck in reducing that number is on the heels of capital. So for example, if we wanted to spend $10 million on the police building next year, right, FY24, but you were concerned that $10 million, shouldn't be accounted for whatever reason in this figure, then we would simply defund that project, put that $10 million back into its savings account that it came from, and you would have effectively reduced this number by $10 million, right? And then you'd have a $187 million budget. My question would be, hopefully, and you would agree, do we really want to wait another year to put that, to put that money into action with the hope that we can actually do the police building for $10 million? That's my goal, $10 million, Chief.
Yeah, right. If we did put it back, that 10 million would be about 8 next year.
Yeah, or in the next 2 years, exactly. That's exactly right. So anyway, that would be what I would tell you be the primary culprit for why you're seeing a $31 million in new budget increases, if you will. There are other culprits, however, okay? It's not just capital, right? Because I would say capital accounts for probably 2/3 of this easily, okay? We do have personnel expenses that are greater than last year's combined set of personnel expenses. And we're gonna go into detail tonight as to how that's, accumulated, if you will. That'll be in positions, that'll be in a raise proposal that we wanna talk to you about this evening. We also have a couple other factors that were surprising to me, frankly, as it relates to, building to this $31 million difference over last year. And if I could real quickly, just take a couple minutes to talk about that, if we could switch to the next slide, because that'll be real consistent with what I need to visit with you about here right now. One of the more jarring numbers that I saw as a result of our growth over last year, if you will, or increases over last year is with respect to property and liability. That figure alone was almost $1 million, all in and of itself. And again, attributable to that $31 million. And so I did ask Tracy and Ethan to give us just a quick primer on why that's the case. Obviously, when you consider $31 million and almost $1 million, that's a small percentage. But by and large, one of our larger increases from an operational perspective that I'd like you to hear about, if that's okay, Mr. Mayor.
Please.
Go ahead.
Thank you. Counselors, this is Ethan Yonker. He's our risk manager. So I know he hasn't had much face time in front of this group so far, but tonight maybe he'll get some. So the hardening of the property insurance market happened this past year was the worst insurance for the property worldwide on record. So that is an attributable factor on how the property insurance hardened and why our premiums are increasing. So our exposure accounts for 90% of our property premium with warm. So just on that, along the lines with our property, so we have losses, but we also, our total insured values, so that's what we want to make sure that we have coverage for in case we have a loss. We have to make sure it's on our schedule of value. Ethan and his team did a great job of assessing our actual property, things that we didn't have on the property schedule, and making sure we had the right amount for all those properties. And then met with all of the directors to say, okay, do we want to add this to our property schedule of values? And so the result, the change in our values for City of Casper on the property side was $239,386,366. So that was a figure that went into the 90% factor on our property side of that premium with warm, okay? Then on the liability side, 75% of the factor is 75% of exposure on our liability premium with warm. So that number, the change in the payroll for the city of Casper that went with warm for them to assess the premium, the change in payroll was $1,946,295. So those two things were big reasons why we had that increase in the insurance premium through warm.
Did you put a value on that, like a percentage, what the increase actually was?
I don't remember off the top of my head, but we could get that for tomorrow night for sure, what that exact increase was.
I mean, is it like a 10% increase? Could it have been that high?
Mayor, Councilman, I don't think it was greater than 10% is what
I don't believe it was either. We will get that number
Yeah,
so that we're not guessing, and we will get that exact number for you. We just had that board meeting, a few weeks ago, where the warm board did that final authorization for the percent that they were gonna allocate. So with that, then we do an allocation through risk management for all of the funds on how we go about assessing them a percentage of the total premium that will be collected to pay for warm. So with that, that's a cost allocation model, and that changed a little bit this year. So that's, if you wanted to learn more about that briefly, Ethan can speak on that if that's something that you'd like to hear a little bit more on. Why don't you give a specific example on the event center, that change?
Sure, so the event center last year, on the previous allocation model, all the allocations were based on the liability exposure. So because the event center doesn't have employees, city employees, there was no liability exposure, so very low insurance premiums. And this year, we made two separate models, one for liability premiums and one for property premiums. So the exposure for property premiums is based on the amount of the value of the insured property. So in the event centers, tens of millions, $71 million, I believe, is what is appraised at. That property insurance premium allocation to the event center increased pretty drastically.
So that's one example. Is that brief enough? You
Yeah,
want more?
is that okay, Mr. Mayor? Any questions?
Anybody have any questions for Tracy or Ethan?
We're here all night with you, so if you think of anything, let us
Yes,
know.
you are.
Thank you.
Thank you.
As a couple of other statistics that you might find surprising, like I did, fuels and gasolines are up by 519,000 across the board. That includes bail fill refuse, that includes, the police department, fire department, and so on. It does not include, however, the prospectus for a whole new bunch of new vehicles that also have to be fueled up. I wanted to make that clear. We have a very, very slim margin of actually new pieces of equipment that would contribute to a figure like that. This is not predicated upon a growing fleet. It is predicated simply on the cost for operating vehicles. And that's the problem with these kinds of increases. It's really hard to tell the police, we want you to drive around about 30% less this year. Or the fire department, we want you to drive around 30% less this year, or the landfill trucks and so on. These kinds of costs are, in my opinion, fairly close to sunk costs, as it were. And so that becomes a real challenge as it relates to trying to bring you a balanced budget without some strategies from a revenue standpoint that we're about to go into here in just a moment. But just to give you a feel, we're also anticipating potentially, and I'm looking at Councilman Cathy, I'm looking at the mayor, a couple others over here, water could be a higher cost for us into the next year. We're anticipating if regional water passes along what we think might happen, that it'll cost us another $389,000 to buy water from regional water. If that doesn't happen, then, we will save quite a bit in expenses with respect to the budget that we're proposing to you right now. But in and of itself, that feels like a big number. A couple other ideas here that gives you a feel as to how we got to that $31 million figure. It's hard for me not to think that that cost of water wouldn't implicate the cost of treating sewage as well, from that standpoint. In that figure alone, we anticipate an additional $539,000 to treat the county's sewage through the wastewater treatment plant. Yes, sir, please.
Is it not fair to assume, though, if that board with my no vote still passes to give you a raise, that we will pass that on to the consumer, thereby not incurring the 390 and the 539?
Depending on what the actual percentage is that comes out of the regional water deliberations, that will dramatically impact those two figures that I just gave you. So, if that percentage is less, then that increase over last year will be less as well. And yes, you're right. That is what we anticipate we would sell to our customers in turn, if you will. Andrew, Bruce, would y'all have any other comments as it relates to treating sewage as far as that bigger figure is concerned?
Mayor, Council, I don't know if the water rate has a direct influence necessarily on the wastewater treatment plant, but certainly our chemical costs have gone skyrocket there, as well as Ethan's job allocation for that was a significant increase because a lot of those buildings were not covered initially under one, and now they are. So those are two big drivers at the wastewater plant. And keep in mind that water, well, we have to pay for the raw water, for wholesale water, we also still have to pump that and distribute it to the system, and it includes capital costs and that. So it's not, you pass along zero from regional water, it doesn't necessarily translate into a zero increase for our consumers, if that helps. Because there are other costs that go into that rate,
Electric, the whole deal.
the whole deal.
But nonetheless, a big factor, certainly a big factor. So moving on then to, from this discussion, are there any other questions as it relates to why our budget is $30 million different than last year? Any other questions? Keep in mind, we will talk personnel in much more detail here in a little bit into the presentation, but any other questions that I can try to entertain?
Jenna?
I was just thinking too, like how much of the growth of Casper has affected the increase of the numbers that we're seeing?
Mr. Mayor, Counselor, I don't know that that population growth is having a huge negative impact with regard to the budget we're presenting to you today. I certainly think that's probably more of a longer term issue, particularly as it relates to, public safety demands and those kinds of things, the likes of which we're trying to catch up with in respect to some of the proposals you're going to see later this evening and, potentially into tomorrow. But beyond that, I wouldn't say, we're not building huge growth factors, for example, into the rates that you would see from a network perspective, from water and sewers standpoint.
Right, that's what I was thinking with the growth of the new developments and things, some of the ones that are coming out.
Right, yeah, we are not calculating huge growth factors in that regard either. So not huge for now.
Mr. Cathy?
I was thinking that basically we've been projecting, what is it, a 0.5% increase in population year over year. So that is what's figured into the budgets. Is that a reasonable assessment as far as police, fire, water expansion, those types of things?
Mr. Mayor,
Kind of an answer to.
Yeah,
Padded,
certainly.
padded.
I would say inflation is probably a bigger factor if you're comparing percentages to each other. than actual population growth and the need to, ramp up infrastructure in response. Okay. All right. Well, let's move on then, if we could. The other concern that comes immediately on the heels of whether or not we've got, a bigger budget and what's the reason and all those kinds of things is whether or not, of course, we are amping up revenues to try to support a much bigger proposal than you have seen in the recent past and so on. And my short answer to that question and that concern that we typically get is, no, I don't think so. I think our projections are fairly conservative and reasonable, and again, based on data that we're looking at right now compared to data that we're sort of betting on, if you will. Let me explain what I mean. The general fund gets a lot of attention in these discussions. And I don't know if you've had the opportunity to pick up on that in the narrative or not yet, because you've only just gotten the narrative, of course. But did you know that as the board of directors for the general fund enterprise of the organization, you actually get to influence, in some cases even very little, 27% of your revenue through decisions that you make? 27%. So as a board of director, when it comes to the largest enterprise of your organization, you get to choose and make decisions and so on that influences 27% of the revenue and the income that you receive to operate a $53 million enterprise that the general fund represents. Conversely, that means that 73% of those decisions are made for you by other entities, completely separate from your influence and authority. Isn't that a marvelous business proposal to consider for a $53 million enterprise? That is absolutely the fact. The largest piece of that 73% revenue portfolio that you don't get to influence is sales tax. And that represents about 43% of that 73% that I am referring to here. Sales tax, sales and use tax, actually. Could we hit the next slide? And actually one more. To give you a little history as to how sales tax has responded here in our community. This is what it looked like in fiscal year 22, which seems like a long time ago. At least for me it does. If you look at fiscal year 23, which is the next slide. Who's pushing this button? Fiscal year 23 was actually quite a bit different. That's the year we're in right now, right? You'll notice that the red line stops short of being complete, and that's because we haven't gotten totally through the current fiscal year, right? We're still finishing that up right now. Fiscal year 23 looks like it operated a little more positively than fiscal year 22 when you look at the actuals. And when you look at this chart over here on the wall, you can see the only pink line, or red line, if you will, depending on how you're looking at it, that represents falling below budget is that very first month that we entered into the fiscal year. So fiscal year 23, from a budgetary and planning perspective, we performed better than we thought we would. And frankly, if you look at how we did compared to budget, that represents about a 9% improvement factor, if you will. And that's great news. We don't typically plan for that type of growth, however, when it comes to the prognostications that we make in May each year. And so from that standpoint, we didn't build that kind of surplus into the budget this time last year.
Lisa?
Have we discovered what attributed to February for that spike? It's a pretty significant spike.
That is a big spike. Usually February represents Christmas because there's a 2-month collections and receipt lag that cities and towns in Wyoming incur with regard to actually getting our check from the state. And so that would be your Christmas sales right here. And that's all I got. Christmas was pretty good. Thank heavens. I'm grateful for that.
I thought it might be Valentine's, but maybe.
Yeah, no, Valentine's actually would be more like right here.
Oh, boo. So sad.
Yeah, the holiday for lovers didn't turn out so well.
Based upon sales tax.
At least it was better than last year. Yeah, that's right.
It was a cold winter.
Yeah, apparently.
Let's look at,
Assuming you're not gonna change the conservative outlook for next year just because we had a decent sales tax year this year, we're gonna continue to be conservative and not anticipate those type of revenues on a consistent basis until it shows us that that's the way it's going to be, right?
Mr. Mayor, I think were I to try to recommend a proposal along those lines, I'd have to say that, we are expecting another 9% year. And I am confident in saying I'm not comfortable in recommending a 9% year. I would not want to go down that level of optimism because I'm not that optimistic. I'm not 9% optimistic, let me put it that way. Craig, however, says that we can, and I mean Craig as in C-R-E-G, not Craig Collins. I don't see him here tonight, but the Craig report suggests that we can be relatively comfortable with a 3% growth over last year. And so with a 3% growth over last year, this is what it would look like for FY24. Next slide, there we go.
Kyle?
Yeah.
Thanks, Bruce. Carter,
Actually, please. Thank you.
sorry to interrupt and sorry to put you on the spot. Do you recall fiscal year '22, what our projected growth was and where we ended up with sales tax? I know we did good on sales tax fiscal year '22 as well. Do you remember what those numbers were? Or
Well,
just for reference?
Mr. Mayor, Counselor, I cannot tell you what we opined back, 2 Mays ago, if you will. But what I do recall for sure is that we were coming off of a COVID scenario. The pandemic period was, sort of tailing off at that time. And we were markedly concerned that we weren't in a recovery period yet, right? 23 certainly represents more of a recovery period than we were concerned 22 would. And it turns out we were pretty close to right. 23 was much more, higher performing than 22. 24 is the dotted line here. And we're suggesting a 3% increase, if you will, growth factor, however you want to call it, in sales and use tax, which is represented, in some of the margins, the net difference between these margins that you're seeing in some of our peaks and valleys in comparison to our actuals from 2023. I would anticipate a softening of 23 going this way, hence the reason, the tail end of proposed 24 probably isn't going to be a growth period of time for the end of that fiscal year either. So we are suggesting a 3% factor as it relates to this particular category of revenue for the general fund. Okay? To dive into this a little further, we can look at history some more. Moving on, if we could. This is a longer term view of our sales tax history. This goes back to what we kind of consider sort of our highest watermark for sales and use tax, and that would have been around the period of 2014 to now. Okay? So over time, we are seeing a positive trajectory. Over the long haul, nearly 10 years, we believe the trajectory to be positive, although not aggressive or ambitious, or excitedly upward. Okay? It's a fairly gradual climb with some high points and certainly some low points. And when you look at the calendar on the bottom, you can kind of correlate where some of those things occur and why some of those things have occurred. Okay? You'll notice these two lines on the end. This is more representative of budget to budget. So budget fiscal year 23, budget that we're in currently, and budget year 24. You're going to notice there's more of a gap there than a 3% difference would otherwise represent. And that's because back in 23, when we planned the budget this time of year, a year ago, we did not know we were going to get a 9% sort of boon, if you will, over that 12-month period. So, if you were to account for that margin would look a lot slimmer as it relates to actuals compared to where we're suggesting you should go for FY24. Okay? Looking at sort of another history sort of slice of this question, if we could hit the next slide, please. This is a countywide distribution and comparison, if you will, with regard to some of our more major industries in the county. By far, retail trade is the leader in Natrona County. In some of our other counties, energy would be right here, would be much more dominant than it is here in Natrona County for whatever reason. But in Natrona County, this is obviously our leader. This is what we're looking at in comparison to 2014, again, kind of our benchmark year to what it is we're experiencing right now, what the most recent data shows us. And, again, that's just kind of a view of what's happening. If we could turn to the next slide, please. Looking at just sales taxes in the general fund for the city of Casper, you can see a little bit of a cyclical pattern, if you will, that in my estimation, this estimate does not push the envelope all that much if you were to agree with our prognostication here, our projection. This is where we think we're going to end, this last portion of the current fiscal year, and this is what we think that'll look like in comparison for next year. Okay? Just sales taxes, kind of the bread and butter for the general fund. Just a projection again, the city of Casper does not have any influence as it relates to how those numbers actually come into the city, but rather a prediction exercise as to where we think we're actually going to end up on the receipt standpoint. Okay? All right, other questions?
I just hope it's not this weatherman game that we play. We're forecasting sunny skies or cloudy skies. I hope this pending recession, if inflation keeps going where it is, doesn't dump the snowfall on 24 and put us in a really bad spot. I'm really, really worried, even at a 3%. That really worries me.
Sure. Yeah, appreciate that.
Steve?
I would have to go along with that concern because of the amount of consumer debt that has grown over the last year. We're at the highest level of consumer debt that we've ever had because people have been out spending for the last year and a half and putting it all on credit card, and that train wreck's fixing to happen. And I guess I'm a little concerned about that as well. The other thing is, from the expense standpoint, if you think we've had bad issues with our fuel costs, if oil hits $100 a barrel, and a lot of our fleet is diesel oriented, we're really gonna get hit there because you'll be back over, well, heck, you're just barely under $4 right now. And you're gonna be pushing $5 for diesel. So, I guess I'm a little concerned about the 3% as well.
Well, just to piggyback what you said, last month, for the first time in the history of the US, consumers put over $1 trillion on their credit cards. I think people have been living beyond their means for a long time.
Yeah.
And I think in order to continue that lifestyle, now they're moving it over into their credit cards. And I'm really, really fearful. And I said this 2 weeks ago in this very room, I'm very fearful of what our fall and winter is gonna look like next year if we don't pull out of this somehow. And we can't just keep printing money on a federal level and think that's gonna fix it, because it's actually exacerbating the problem. So, I think 3% is, I just don't know that it's conservative enough, and I don't know that we have a choice in it. Like you said, this one's kind of beyond our control, but
I guess along those lines, I guess that Christmas spike, I don't see it being what it was this year at all because of what we're just talking about. People are maxed out on their credit cards. They're not gonna be able to spend the way they did at Christmas. They probably won't be able to starting to run out of spending money for local vacations and things this year.
Amber?
The reason,
Oh, sorry.
Oh,
I thought you were done.
following up on that as well, you were talking about the mining sector. Even though we have a lot of the service companies here in town, sales taxes are paid on the point of use. And so if a logging truck leaves Casper and goes to Campbell County to log a well, or Evanston, which I think is in Lincoln County, those sales taxes on that invoice go to either Lincoln or Campbell County. They don't come to us. So, and we have not that much going on from a oil and gas standpoint here in Natrona County. Most of it is in our surrounding areas, and a lot of the service companies are not necessarily bringing in the rotating crews that they used to, and our hotel occupancy has dropped, and we're having to rely on that as opposed to the hotel occupancy based on the oil and gas industry, along with then their meals that the out-of-towners are eating.
Sure,
So,
you bet.
Amber?
Thank you. Carter, in your memory, how many times have you overestimated your prediction in sales tax increase year over year?
It's a great question. Yeah.
Counselor, this is my 19th budget that I've presented to councils just like you. And that's happened twice. Once during the fallout in Campbell County when the coal mines all closed up in the period of 30 days. And probably I would be guilty of that during the pandemic period when the government shut down all the businesses and that kind of thing. That's probably it.
So you came out okay in 15, 16, 17?
2008, yeah.
Okay.
Mr. Pacheco?
Yeah, just to kind of tag on what Amber was saying, I think it's a pretty good indication of how accurate, your team is and what understanding the process, understanding the economic nuances of it. It's very complicated. It's not as easy as one would think, and so I think you guys have a pretty good grasp on it. And in the 9 years I've seen it, I've seen you guys have been, even when you're not in that seat,
Sure,
other
yeah.
city managers were pretty darn close to doing that as well. And so you guys have the resources and the professional aptitude to get it done, so.
Does Craig anticipate downturns and things like that? I'm assuming they do the inflationary thing, they break it down to mineral states, things like that?
Mr. Mayor, you are absolutely correct. In fact, normally Craig is not a bellwether that I would use. But given our concerns with respect to some of the recessionary trends that the both of you have referred to, we decided to take the more conservative approach that Craig typically, sort of lays that baseline for in the projections that we're presenting to you tonight. Normally, over the years, I've seen Craig just be a baseline, and generally speaking, the locality outperforms what it is that Craig suggests for the state. This time around, however, we used Craig as the guiding sort of measure for what we're projecting for you tonight.
Thank you. Go ahead, Lisa.
So what we're kind of seeing in real estate, which might also help for the indicator, is housing prices are not coming down. We actually have more demand than we do supply, so it's actually pushing prices up. And it's also a lot of people who maybe they don't want to buy a house with the interest rate or something. It's pushed them into the rental market. So the rental rates are at an all-time high. Property values are at an all-time high. And then honestly, we're seeing a lot of commercial people coming in, people looking at setting up a business, small businesses and shops. So right now we're just having a lot of people asking for shops and small spaces to just set up their own business. So real estate wise, we're very strong, and I'm not anticipating that to change this year. It's very strong. We're not having, we still have the blue wave, but not to the degree that it was.
Just to give you some insight with respect to some of the other revenue strategies that you will find in your book, not to totally depart from sales tax necessarily, but to add to what it is we're talking about here from a broader general fund revenue perspective, you will notice in your book that we're projecting gaming revenue for the general fund to be up 72%. That might sound a little shocking, but when you look at what we're actually receiving compared to what we projected a year ago, we are going to hit 72% this fiscal year. So we're essentially projecting, or very close, we're essentially projecting a no growth over fiscal year 24 for gaming. I happen to think gaming is going to come in stronger over the next fiscal year. I bet you, did you catch that? I bet you that this time next year we're going to say we had no idea gaming was going to be as aggressive 12 months later. But we are suggesting 72% over what we proposed a year ago. We have been given information from the county that property taxes are going to be up in the neighborhood of 15 to 17% over the next year. It's probably not a huge surprise to many of us. One of the things that we were a little worried about and maybe too conservative on is with regard to our building over the next year. Generally speaking, we try to be pretty conservative with regard to that number because we never really know until we see it come across our desk, as it were, in the form of building plans being submitted and those kinds of things. And to date, some of the building plans that have been brought in just don't amount to the $1.5 million that we've used for building permit revenue in the past. We're suggesting we're going to be in the neighborhood of, like $850,000. I'm rounding as I speak to you right now, but in the neighborhood of $850,000, which actually represents a 28% cut from where we thought we were going to be this time last year. So, going forward throughout the next 12 months. I hope we're wrong in that regard. I hope our building community is a lot more aggressive than what we're anticipating. But we always take the same approach. We'd rather project on what we know than what we're trying to bet on. Okay? So we may be too conservative there. One of the most shocking figures, however, if you just peruse through the revenue sheet in your book, will be the 828% increase that we're proposing for one of our revenue categories in the general fund, which actually only amounts to about $2 million, but 828% sounds like a pretty big leap. It did to me. That is strictly what it is that we think we can take into the general fund as it relates to our new approach with respect to investment in the general fund. As you all know, we've talked about this a number of times before with you. We are taking a more aggressive approach with respect to investments. The general fund has a number of pools of cash, if you will, that we are collapsing into one revenue fund, line in this fund that we think will bring about $2.1 million, which does represent a rather large increase over what we've done in the past. And frankly, that's been just a wonderful opportunity for us that some could argue is a feature of an inflationary period. I'm not totally sure, but what I want you to be certain of is we are not taking a speculatory position as it relates to that figure. Now, as I say that, and you were to quiz me, particularly if you were a bunch of financial advisors around the table, I'd be really nervous and intimidated because I'm not the best to answer what I totally mean by that. But if you do have additional technical questions, we can certainly turn that time over to Jill to walk us through some of those strategies if you'd like. What do you think? We good?
Well, some of us have already seen her magic through the Joint Powers Water Board and what it's done and how it's worked, so.
Yeah, I would agree. As well as those of you on the Finance Committee, you've got a lot of primer with respect to this overall strategy, so much of this detail will not be surprising to you, right? But nonetheless, I did want you to be aware of that, because that will be a shocking figure when you run across it in your book. I tell you what, though, not only are we able to look at these income opportunities in the light that it is able to sustain services more effectively over time. Certainly, I think we may have to be real critical of interest income strategies as the economy nationally changes and the cost of lending changes and all those kinds of things, right? We're going to keep our eye on that as we move forward, for sure. The one thing that this set the table perfectly for us, that in my opinion is a junction we cannot ignore if indeed we are concerned about sustainability, and that is the opportunity to, at this point in time, remove direct distribution out of the operations of the general fund. Now, for those of you who are new to the council, you have not heard my concerns being expressed as much as some of the other legacy members of the council about the incorporation of direct distribution into the operations of the general fund. Over time, that has meant, $3.5 to $4.5 million in the general fund portfolio of revenues to use for operations. Now, as we've just described, in many cases, the costs that we have to contend with in operations are costs that are very hard to avoid. Again, we can't tell the police department, I want you to drive 30% less this year, or the fire department, and so on. Which is the reason I've always been concerned about direct distribution, primarily because the legislature, since its inception, has told us, don't count on direct distribution for ongoing costs and ongoing operational liabilities. Since I've been here, that's been a real concern of mine. The employees would recall that. Some of you who've been on the council for a long time know that. We are now at the point where we think we can get rid of it out of the operations of the general fund, and here's how. Next slide, please.
Go ahead.
Hey, Carter?
Yes,
sorry,
please.
Real quick, can you, unless you're gonna do it in this slide, could you, for my benefit, but also that my newer colleagues, explain what exactly direct distribution is? It's kind of a hard concept to wrap your head around.
Absolutely. No, I certainly can. Direct distribution was brought into the pantheon of local government financing technically way back in the year 2000. It was at that time that the legislature decided they would cap the amount of revenue and income that cities and towns could receive through minerals and severances. So for a long time, probably since the 60s, cities and towns have been able to enjoy the benefits of minerals and severances being collected throughout the state just as much as the state could, until the year 2000, when the state said, nah, you're going to be kept here from now on. So that brought forth the idea of direct distribution. They used to call it above the cap distribution monies. And so from that point forward, the legislature said, hey, we will give you one-time payments to try to make up for those differences that you would have otherwise gained, if you will, through the benefit of increased minerals and severances around the state. The other program that came to pass that direct distribution has also been connected to as sort of a reparation program for cities and towns is when the grocery tax got killed for you know at the sort of the benefit of cities and towns. So historically, cities and towns had been able to reap tax revenue, if you will, from a broader base of taxes collected in the grocery store. When the legislature decided to eliminate that as a program that cities and towns would benefit from, they said, hey, don't worry, we'll make it up to you. And the reality is the only way they've made it up to us is by pointing to above the cap and direct distribution, which again is the same program. So the point of my story is they really never did make it up except through direct distribution. Now, thankfully, they really haven't taken direct distribution away since that point in time. However, they have threatened that it would be reduced, that it would be vaporized, that it would be unrecognizable, so don't count on it, kind of a thing.
Well, they tried to do that this year, in fact.
Yeah, fortunately, however, the governor said, wait a minute, we don't want to do that. And he actually incorporated an amendment that allowed direct distribution to grow a little bit. And for the city of Casper, that meant right under $3 million, if I remember correctly, in a true one-time payment. Okay, does that help as a primer?
It does, thank you.
The problem is, when we incorporated direct distribution probably some 7 or so years ago into the operations of the general fund, to me that represented a fairly significant vulnerability given the way that the legislature has always contextualized direct distribution or above the cap payments. And so until now, we really have not had an answer to give you in terms of the ways in which we can relieve the dependence upon that program. So let's move through the next slide here if we could, because this is what it is that we're proposing we do in order to get rid of that dependence or at least reduce it, okay? We could hit the next slide, please. We've got a number of strategies that we're proposing. Number one, without a doubt, when you look at interest income in particular, that to me represents a revenue replacement opportunity that we really haven't had in the past. And so to the extent of just over $1 million, if you will, if you could hit the next slide, that helps us to sort of reconsider another revenue that would replace that to some degree, not entirely. We also, however, had the opportunity to consider a number of expenses that in its one-time capacity comes in much greater alignment with the original purpose and meaning of direct distribution if you listen to the current dialogue of the legislature. One-time payments for one-time expenses. This is a variety of one-time expenses that we could consider ostensibly into what I would suggest be a newly created direct distribution fund. So that pool of funding could be reflective of how we've done business with that money from now on. That level of transparency has not been available in this organization until, what it is we're proposing here.
Is the $7 million number there, is that an actual number? That's not a projection?
Mr. Mayor, Counselor, thank you for that question. That is an actual number, mostly because that final payment that sort of gets us into the black, if you will, with regard to direct distribution is largely fueled by the amendment that the governor championed in this most recent legislative session. Now, you will notice, however, that for that payment in particular, we are not recommending any expenses, and that's because we don't recommend any one-time expenses or capital expenses or whatever until we actually have that money on hand. So that's why you will see a $3.9 million balance in this fund next year at this time that you can consider for capital or other one-time expenses, going into FY25.
What happens to all of those in the one-time expense column if we don't receive direct distribution next year? They've got to go right back into the general fund, right?
Or we don't do them. That's right. So
how do we not subsidize the ice arena, the rec center, Hogadon? I mean,
yeah, well,
they're not really one-time expenses.
No, and I'm not trying to suggest that you got a little ahead of me there. Subsidies, I'm not trying to suggest are one-time expenses. When it comes to the true one-time expenses, however, I am suggesting that those could be easily eliminated, and even though it hurt from an operational standpoint to not have to buy or not be allowed to buy, some of these kinds of things, we could still operate. And that's the idea. That's the philosophy behind this. Now, yes, you are totally correct. If we, for example, were not able to supply next year's version of that figure to aquatics, yes, I would agree. We'd have to go back to the general fund in order to make that up, or 1%, like we do now. So that point is very valid, absolutely. And that, is certainly an approach that council may not agree with, in which case we would just dump that right back into the general fund. And that really means that we'd probably take direct distribution out of that fund into the general fund to make it happen. My point with creating a separate fund, however, is that we are more closely presenting the cost of doing business for both the general fund as well as how exactly we're using direct distribution. Because previously, direct distribution was totally buried in the operations of the general fund, and you really had no idea how it was that direct distribution was being spent. Furthermore, you didn't have a real accurate representation of how the general fund was being supported either. And so with the separation here and the removal of these expenses out of the general fund, you improve in both camps, in my opinion, when it comes to transparency.
I was just gonna say, I think that makes a lot of sense because, even for the ones that would be ongoing subsidies, you're diminishing the impact on your general budget.
Yes.
For that time.
Correct.
Which gives you some breathing room there, but yeah. Makes sense.
And frankly, Mr. Mayor, if I may, Councilor, the point you're making is this really is not a cost of the general fund.
Right.
It's a cost of the aquatics fund that direct distribution is helping to support. And ostensibly, if you've got a legislator coming to you and saying, yeah, we're going to kill direct distribution, you get to say, okay, well, you're going to kill us when it comes to aquatics. You're going to kill us in our support of the health department. You're gonna kill us in respect to our support of any variety of things that, that direct distribution can help us. You don't have to worry, however, that the operations of the general fund won't continue, which is a hallmark of why I would propose we go this way, so that general fund operations, the hardcore operations of the general fund, are no longer speculative on a unilateral decision of the legislature. By the way, that $4.8 million that was historically included in the general fund would have changed that ratio that I was discussing earlier. I told you 27%. If we had direct distribution in that mix, your figure would drop from 27% to probably 15%. In terms of revenue, you actually get to decide or even have a modicum of influence over. So 72%, not great, but it's better than, 80% of inability, right? Or whatever that figure would be. For what it's worth. I would suggest, however, if whether you agree or disagree in terms of what should be included, removing in large part direct distribution out of the general fund, this is the time to do it. This is the time to create that level of transparency as well as to reduce that vulnerability and increase your sustainability in the general fund.
Well, in fairness to transparency, what did you use to decide what goes on this list? Why isn't Ford Wyoming Center on there? Why isn't the subsidy for that one on there? What criteria did you use, I guess, to decide what went on this and what didn't?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Mayor. And I would tell you that every bit of this is debatable. It really is. The Ford Wyoming Center was purposely not included. And that's primarily because we've got a long-term operating agreement with that operation that we really can't default on. And so, that to me felt a little different, just simply because we've got that contractual obligation.
And we're not under the same obligation with Hogadon?
We have obligations for sure. There's no doubt. And it's definitely an operation that we have to sustain somehow, right? But I'm hoping that Hogadon and this figure that this program contributes, this year it's $168,000, with the right decisions over time will drop dramatically. That's my hope. But I don't want the general fund necessarily to be on the hook to make that happen if we don't have to. Simply because it's got a lot of operations it's got to sustain otherwise.
Fair enough.
But agreed, any of this is debatable. That is absolutely correct. Okay? Other questions about direct distribution at all? This is the first step in one that has been needed for a long, long time. Too long, probably. All right. If that's okay, then we'll go ahead and move to some of your other bigger decisions that need to be made, and certainly impactful, not only to the general fund, but to the other funds as well. The general fund will certainly bear the largest part of this ask, if you will, and I will likely turn to some of our colleagues around the room here tonight to help us through some of these discussions and justifications and that kind of thing. But we are asking for new positions. Some of those new positions are positions that we have defunded over the years, given some of the steps we've had to take in recent years in order to contain our costs and fight off the growing demands for service and so forth as best we could. In some cases, we just simply can't keep up any longer. One of the biggest requests that we have, if I could go to the next slide, is with regard to the fire department. This is the biggest request you've seen come out of the fire department in probably a couple decades, I would suggest. And I'm going to give you the heads up in advance. A real similar request would be coming again in FY '25. And this represents, in my opinion, a fairly significant service deficiency that we have tolerated and put up with, and hoped that it wouldn't directly impact someone's safety individually with regard to the truck rescue operation that this would help support. Next year, however, we are hopeful that that second tranche, if you will, of requests will be supported by an offsetting series of revenue through a grant that we're aggressively pursuing to try to keep that out of the burden of the general fund, at least for the short run, next 3 or so years. In which case, I would hope that we could kind of catch up with those costs and transition those costs more, smoothly over time. This year won't be necessarily the case. However, I would say that an offsetting operational expense that would come close to equating to that request right there is in the form of what we call callbacks, which is the situation we find ourselves in, and that you're going to get to hear about when it comes to our third amendment for the current budget year from the chief, where he discusses a lot of the detail as to the position we're finding ourselves with regard to callbacks.
Along that lines, basically, you're gonna wind up partially funding those regular time firefighters with the overtime that we're currently paying due to the callbacks, aren't we?
Mr. Mayor, Counselor, that's exactly what I'm trying to say. Yeah. And I would say more than partially, I think we'll come real close to funding it totally.
I was thinking that's what
Overtime.
the earlier presentation from the chief had mentioned, so, okay.
I think we'll come real close to funding that totally. Okay, would you agree, Chief?
Yes, sir.
It feels like a big request. It is a big request, particularly when you consider what you'll likely see in FY '25 when we're here this time next year. But I would tell you, it is really likely that we should have considered this a number of years ago, before now. My humble opinion. Any other questions about that segment of position requests that I could defer to the chief?
I have one question. Chief, how many, or does this reflect any of the positions that are gonna replace the retired? I know we're having a plethora of retirees over the next 2 years. So, or is that just a trade one for the other, so it doesn't reflect?
Mr. Mayor, these are additional positions.
Okay.
And as those people retire, it's gonna be an ebb and flow of retiring and replacing those. We're doing active recruitment, replacement right now. This is just gonna help stabilize our outdated staffing levels and help make it.
I'm assuming budgetarily though, it'll help you in the long run because you're replacing more expensive, longevity with newer at a lower rate.
Absolutely.
Okay.
And one could argue that could help us here as well.
Sure.
But
That's where I was.
marginally so, yeah. Okay, the next, I would say probably, okay, before we, okay, yeah, no, let's go
And
back
there we
one
are.
more, let's go back one more. Thank you, there we go. The police department probably has the next largest segment of employee requests, about half the size of what fire's asking for this year. You all are aware that we've entered into an agreement with the school district wherein we've agreed to provide 2 additional campus officers, raising our team from, our operating team, if you will, from 6 to 8 as far as officers on campus and so forth. That represents what that figure is supposed to mean right here. However, the police department is also looking for a training supervisor in the dispatch area, if you will, that in my opinion feels a pretty significant need that they have gone without for quite some time, or have relied on current staff to, leave their existing job to do for the rest of the team at what some would argue is some hardship and not as effective as a job they could be doing otherwise. So training has become a much more increased focus throughout the police department as well as the fire department. And I don't think we should leave dispatch out of that increased concentration. To date, they have been, in terms of some of the investment that we've made in other public safety parts of our operation. Do you mind if I defer to the chief for a little more guidance on that position?
Please do.
Mayor, Council, Carter, thank you for the opportunity. As it currently exists, our dispatchers are required to do academy training plus continuous ongoing training. To accomplish that right now, what it means is our supervisor has to stop being a supervisor. They go into the adjacent portions of the building where they're away from the consoles, they're away from being able to guide the other dispatchers through these difficult circumstances that are happening and conduct weeks of training. It's not an efficient way of doing our operations. The training that we're getting at the academy was not up to the standards that we expect of our emergency operations here, and so that training function is absolutely critical. We've begun to see some slippage in just a few circumstances where the training was identified as the culprit in something that could have been handled better. Not something that went wrong, but could have just been, could have been done better. And so what the critical thing that we're trying to accomplish is last year our supervisor was out of the arena, not supervising for more of the year than they were. We're trying to improve the quality of our training and also maintain the efficiency of operations as we handle those day-to-day emergencies that are occurring 24 hours a day.
Any questions for Chief? Thank you.
A few other positions that we have in mind and hope you will support. We are asking that one of the operators out at the bail field be increased from a part-time to full-time operator. We can certainly talk to that as well. Regional Water has recently concurred with the idea that the administrative assistant position be increased as well from a part-time to full-time employee. Keep the relationship between Regional Water and the city of Casper is a unique one, but nonetheless, council does get the opportunity to weigh in whether or not this makes sense. And again, we can address some of those questions as well. As it relates to buildings and structures, we are suggesting bringing on an administrative assistant in that operation beginning in January, which for all intents and purposes feels like a part-time employee. But the reality is it will be a full-time employee starting in January. And that's primarily a function of trying to get buildings and structures in the same operating model that we have in Fleet, wherein we essentially are operating for a charge for service operation that we are experiencing a lot of positive benefits in a similar way in Fleet. So we're trying to transition that model to buildings and structures, and in doing so, we really believe that clerical support will be tremendously helpful to make sure we bill appropriately, keep up with the numbers appropriately, and have this lift of this way of doing business become much more streamlined and effective. A couple other ideas that we want to run by you, and again, open up any questions you might have. This automotive tech, that we would actually bring into Fleet would be a partnership that we have with regard to Liz's division in transit. Transit is willing to pay for that position so that they can get dedicated, undivided attention with regard to the repairs and maintenance that the bus fleet is very demanding of. As you can imagine, we put a lot of miles on that fleet. We have a lot of repair issues, oil changes and those kinds of things, tires we got to keep up with. The feds are real picky about the standards by which we do every one of those things. and dedicated automotive tech to that function would be really, really helpful, not only for transit, but with respect to all the other work orders that Dan and his team have to facilitate and not be diverted from in order to deal with buses. So that really is a general fund neutral request. The recreation coordinator in the ice arena, I don't know if you knew this or not, but Chad is essentially the only full-time employee we have in ice. And from that standpoint, as the manager, that puts him in a lot of operational duties that distracts from his managerial duties that this position will hopefully help with. Zulima, however, can shed a lot more light on that request if you prefer. She's also asking, however, that we look for an additional parks maintenance tech. The good news is we have an additional fund that will help support this position so that the general fund is not the only supporter of this increased request. And that weed and pest fund is made a reality for us because of that mill levy that exists that we get to draw from in order to fund that operation, which is a really nice benefit here for the city of Casper. What questions can we entertain that are essentially non-public safety related, or we can certainly go back into public safety as well?
Kyle?
Thanks, Bruce. Thanks, Carter. My guess is it's self-explanatory, but in the parentheses where it says fiscal year 17, 18, and 18 for the replenish positions, that simply means we are staffing that position again after it was cut in those years. Is that an accurate assumption?
Mr. Mayor, Councilor, we shed those positions during the austerity measures of those years. That's right. That's exactly right. You got it.
Questions? We're rolling.
All right. Before we go to this one, thank you. I wanted to bring that total to your attention. The general fund represents about $880,000 of that cost. And the other funds, utilities, et cetera, make up the difference for that overall grand total. And those are loaded figures, by the way, with respect to the true cost of bringing on this request.
And you have these already in the budget?
Yes, sir. We sure do. But that doesn't mean we can't adjust the budget if council so desires. Okay? All right, now moving on, FY25. Just to give you a little bit of a sneak peek with regard to what we think we're gonna need, because we really try to be circumspect into the future with regard to some of our current deficiencies and struggles that we're having right now. I warned you, I think Chief Black's gonna come back for this. However, with the good work of his team and so forth, he's also gonna bring revenue that helps support that. Thanks, Chief. Unfortunately, we probably won't be able to say that about the rest of these requests. However, these are requests that we've, like I said, are currently struggling with. We really believe will be necessary for the provision of these services, particularly with regard to the growing demands that each of these areas represent. And in many cases, I think help further your goals as well. So I'm not asking for direction on this. However, I did want to give you a little bit of an insight as to what you'll potentially see next year.
Carter, if we go back to 24, we don't need to go back. I'm just saying if we go back, this council had authorized you to have a new staff position in your office, and I noticed they're not on there. Is that because you're going to commingle that with a position is that why we're not seeing it?
Mr. Mayor, the only reason you're not seeing it is because that's a current year issue. And we're talking about projected requests for next year and the year beyond.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay, thank you for that question. All right, let's move on from that slide if we could. When you talk about your human capital, physicians aren't the only cost that you have to consider, right? You have to consider the costs to maintain your human capital as well. Your human resource represents a significant portion of your overall operational cost, and I would say probably exceeds 50% of what you spend every year in the operations of your organization. And so from my standpoint, it really helps to spend some time to go through this conversation and hear what it is that we're proposing. Now, without a doubt, last year, when we were in front of you in May of last year, we had a variety of suggestions and requests. We were coming into a fairly aggressive inflationary period. Turns out we were right. It was a pretty aggressive inflationary period. We're not necessarily requesting that COLAs be a part of the mix this time around. Certainly, if council views things differently, we are prepared to demonstrate what any suggestion you might have would do to your budget as it relates to what you've got lined out in front of you tonight. As far as what the budget accommodates right now, and what you're going to see in the numbers that you stroll through in your book, we are proposing a base increase of about 3.5% for the broad average, if you will, of employees in the organization. In the public safety world, that's called a step increase. In the non-public safety world, we're just calling it a wage increase, if you will, because we don't have as formalized a step structure in the non-public safety arena. So broadly speaking, we're suggesting that for the non-public safety employees, a 3.5% increase for those who are eligible, because you'll recall that there are a number of employees who are placed within their respective wage band where there's no longer 3.5% room with respect to where they are in relation to the cap that their individual wage band has for their position. Okay? So some folks are going to be capped out. They're already at the top of their wage band. They're already making the most that their position will pay. And so this 3.5% would not apply to those folks. Okay?
But it could, to get them there, if there's a 2% gap, it would fill that.
If there's a 2% gap, yes, that's right. That's exactly right.
Go ahead.
It just wouldn't be the full 3.5.
Right, understood.
Right?
I guess I thought that with the grave study, we kind of eliminated a lot of that so that it allowed more room. Is that not really the case?
Mr. Mayor, Councilor, you're totally correct. The grave study did allow, or does allow, for a broader expanse, if you will, of earnability. That's probably my term more than the professional term. There's more of an upend for most positions in the organization, okay? However, we've had that plan in place now for 3 or so years, and people have progressed to the point that they are approaching the end of their range. And in those cases, there will be employees who won't receive the full 3.5. There will also be employees who, even though they get 3.5, they'll still have some more room to go toward the end of their band. Okay? So in some cases, 3.5 will be, there'll be plenty of room still. In some cases, folks are close enough to the end that they won't actually receive a 3.5. Okay?
Steve?
If I remember right as well, along with that study, if we were to give the 3.5 across the board, as that's talking about there, what you're saying is on all of those wage bands and graves, they would all go up 3.5%. Is that correct? And you are still saying that even with those bands going up, that 3.5%, we would still have 61 full-time employees that would still not get a raise in effect. Is that correct?
Mr. Mayor, Councilor, I may need to dissect that question a little bit, so bear with me, yeah. In the case of a COLA, where we're talking about cost of living allowance increases and those kinds of things.
And that's what you're talking about, if I understood, with that 3.5%.
No,
Oh,
right.
okay.
Which is why I appreciate the question, because I
Okay.
want to be uber clear. Yeah,
Okay,
we are not talking about a COLA. We are not talking about a COLA.
okay,
Yeah, we are not talking about a cost of living allowance increase.
okay.
This is simply the means by which people can progress through their current wage band. Okay? This is available to most of our employees. However, there will be some that they won't get the full 3.5. Okay?
But they're already enjoying the top of their wage earning capabilities.
Right. A COLA, on the other hand, would do exactly what you're describing.
Okay.
Wherein the top end of that band goes up by 3.5%. That's not what we're proposing at this point in time.
Okay.
You did that twice in the previous fiscal year. You did that once in July, and you did that once in January, incidentally, by that same amount, 2 times.
If I remember correctly, over the last year, a lot of our employees have seen almost a 20% increase in their income based on COLAs, raises, and one-time payments that this council and the previous council gave them. So we have been very generous with our employees, and I would like to see us do it again, because I have a feeling we're heading into some leaner years, and it may be a while before they'll see another increase. And so while we do have the capabilities of doing it, I am all for doing it, literally, right now, because it could literally be the last time in a while that it happens. I'd like to be wrong, and I'd like to see us be able to do that, but reality is what it is. So I think when we're in a situation where we can do it, we should do it, and because there's gonna be some lean years coming where we're not gonna be able to do that. And if you remember, it wasn't 3 years ago, we were coming up to the end of a wage freeze that we'd been in for quite a while, especially, I know our police department, and it had been a substantial amount of time since they'd had any increase at all. So it's been nice to be able to do it, but I think we're getting to the end of that, so we probably, since we have the allocation, we probably better get it done.
Mr. Mayor, if I may respond just a touch, you know, the pandemic period certainly represented a period of time where we had significant uncertainty about our financial future. That was when businesses were shut down. That was when Dr. Dowd showed up at the event center and shut down that state tournament. Horrific things were occurring to our local economy, right? And so we did incorporate not only freezes, but we did furloughs as well, if you remember. It was a rough period. The great news is we're not anywhere near that right now. This is very doable. I am not suggesting a COLA on top of this or anything like that. But the other thing that I would ask you to think about and kind of, you know, have in your mind as we start through the new fiscal year, I would like to come back to you at the end of the calendar year, which represents a 50% mark, if you will, for the fiscal year, and talk about at least one-time payments at that point in time.
Like we did last year?
Yeah, like we did last year, yeah. And so one-time payments obviously are contingent upon having the available cash to make that happen. And so I'm not prepared to provide you a proposal now, but I would at least like you to have your minds open anyway to that possibility. And if something happens to where either the economy is suffering from an inflation hit, or we're receiving much more revenue than we anticipated, maybe we could at that point talk about a COLA. That's not on my horizon right now, however. I would like to consider this as well as a possibility for a one-time payment at the end of the year. Now, keep in mind though too, public safety is a little different in its operation. One of the main features of the Grave study was to keep a real structured STEP program in police. Police has a 5% step that they go through whenever you say a step is okay. All right? So we're asking that you say a step is okay. It actually means something different than that, however. It typically means it's more of a 5% increase for those employees that have the room in their band. And undoubtedly, there are employees that don't have 5% left in their respective wage bands because of whatever, steps they've gotten in the past. So you have that same, sort of implication with regard to where everybody might be, but in police's standpoint, a step means 5%, not 3.5. Okay? The same is true for fire, but it's only because they're not on the Graves plan. And so we have them still on the old step plan, wherein there will be firefighters who receive a 5% step, and there will be firefighters who won't because they're at the top of their wage band, right? So all those caveats are the same. The difference would be what those percentages actually translate to be, depending on where you're at in the organization and in your own wage band. Okay? So that's the proposal as it relates to wages for your human resources here in the organization, your employees.
Does anybody have any questions or thoughts about the raise for our employees? I mean, I'm all for it, so, but I'm one of 9, so. Any other comments? Michael Bond?
Carter, can you talk about the line 53, the fire union? What is that exactly?
That is exactly what I just described to you
Okay.
about them being on a different plan. They're
Oh,
on,
the ones that are on the old.
right,
Fields.
you
Okay,
got it.
thank you.
And it represents also a 5% step.
Okay.
And that's part of their collective bargaining agreement.
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay, well, no other questions, sir? Steve, you have a question? There's one more
noticed a big-
question, sir.
Yeah, one more question. I noticed a big yellow strip up there. Are we supposed to figure out something to put in there? Or are you recommending anything? Or where does that big yellow strip fall into that budget number?
The big yellow strip is available for any inputs that you all would want to direct this evening. So for example, if you wanted to do a one-time payment now, somewhere in that yellow strip, Jill would enter a number, her and Pete, that would give you instantly the impact to the budget were you to carry through that particular recommendation. If you wanted to do a COLA, somewhere in that yellow strip, there's a magical cell that we would enter that number. And instantly, you'd be able to tell what that would do to your budget. And frankly, it would, it would upend what it is we prepared in hard copy, but that's okay. That's why we're here.
No,
Talk about those options.
kind of sticks out a little bit, so, but you have not figured anything at all into the budget, if I read it right, for any numbers going into that column.
Right, because that primarily includes, Mr. Mayor, Counselor, one-time payments, COLAs, or if you wanted to consider that figure differently as well.
Because it is figured for 3.5%.
Your budget is figured for 3.5%, that's exactly right. But that does not mean that we won't take different direction.
Sure,
You know what I mean?
sure. Go ahead.
But if I understood what you said as well, there would be 61 people up in that top category that would not get that 3.5%, depending on where they were. They may get a 1% raise,
Right.
or they may not get anything.
Right.
But there are 61 people that are full-time employees who would receive something less than 3.5%.
Jill, is that the correct translation of those figures?
Actually, the 61 people would get absolutely nothing.
Oh,
So
okay.
the other people who got a portion are in that blue bucket. They've already been figured into the budget.
Thank you.
But do keep in mind, even though those 61 people get nothing, they are at the top of their wage for the entire market area.
Yeah.
And have been.
Correct.
So, Lisa.
Why are we just looking at giving a raise and not another, just calling it a COLA? What is the differences between the two?
Mr. Mayor, Counselor, great question. A COLA is what we would sort of calculate against the cost of living, which generally is driven by inflationary figures and so on, right? Because council made those kinds of adjustments within the last 6 months, we did not figure it would be recommendable to do it again now. Now, in 6 months, council may see things differently. You may see things differently tonight. But from our standpoint and from the standpoint of trying to, play it fairly conservative, we are suggesting a wage increase only and not a COLA, because a COLA has the effect of not only hitting, nearly every employee in the organization, it also has the effect of raising the top end of that wage band for every employee as well, by that whatever percentage you tell us to incorporate, which harkens back to the conversation I was having with Councilor Cathy.
Because if we did a COLA, then the 61 people would then get the raise.
Nearly everybody in the organization would get the raise, that's right. That's exactly right. And so then the question becomes, do you do a COLA at the expense of doing a wage increase in each of the steps, or do you do both? Last year you did both. You did 2 hits of the COLA as well as a 5% wage increase for those who were eligible. We're suggesting that level is not what we'd recommend right now.
Mr. Gamros.
Thanks, Bruce. Could you enlighten me and us, I guess, Carter, the 3.5% wage, is that automatic based on years of service, or is that based on evaluation? How do people earn wages within the organization, I guess? Thank you.
Mr. Mayor, Councilor, the employees in the organization can earn raises in a variety of ways. Certainly, there's promotions where people can get raises. Certainly, there's what we call natural progression, which when, certain positions hit certain certifications, or like in the PD's situation where they become a master police officer and so on, those include raises. And we try to figure that into what we propose to you every year as well. Or there are the COLAs, where cost of living dictates a broad increase for, nearly every person in the organization, that, going back to Councilor Cathy's conversation, actually increases the wage band by whatever percentage you agreed to. Or there's the wage increase possibility, where within every individual wage band, you allow for whatever percentage in the form of a step each year.
Yeah, please.
Thanks for the additional information. So if an individual working for the city stays within the same title, they do not earn additional certifications, it's essentially the same position as the year prior, do they automatically get a 3.5% raise? Or I guess that's my question. If there's no added certifications, if there is no promotion or increase, progressive movement up the ladder, is it an automatic wage increase, or is it based on their performance as an employee? I mean, thanks.
Thank you for the question.
Depends on where they're at on their scale. If they're at the top of the scale for that particular item, then they would not get a raise.
Right. I would not say that, aside from natural progression or promotions or whatever, that there really is such a thing as an automatic raise. Council gets to determine, based on the budgetary conditions of the day, whether or not employees get raises. And that's primarily with regard to your analysis of that figure right there. Okay? There really is not an automatic raise for anyone in the organization. Okay? Now, certainly as it relates to promotions, certainly as it relates to natural progression and that level of achievement, whatever that might be, those things are more automated, if you will. But in terms of an employee expecting a raise every single year, despite what the budget conditions of the year might be, no, I would suggest that that's not an automatic. That's a decision that you make every year.
Go ahead, Steve.
And if I understand what you're saying correctly, that if you have category XYZ, and you have 10 employees in there, you are not evaluating them as 1 through 10 based on performance, with 1 maybe getting a 5% and 10 getting a 0.5%. Everybody in there is lumped the same, and they would all get the 3.5. In other words, it's not a performance-based raise.
It's not a performance-based raise. We do not have a performance-based. You could be a good employee, you could be a marginal employee, you could be a bad employee. If you
You're in
say,
that group.
that's right, and you got the room, and council says, let's give everybody a step increase who's eligible, they're gonna get it regardless of their employment status with the organization. I mean, they gotta be an employee, right? But they don't necessarily have to be a high-performing employee. I mean, that's our framework.
That food's been here since 3, so let's take a break, and we'll come back to this after everybody gets something to eat. Okay?
Very good. Thank you, everybody, for hanging in there.
Any idea where Jenna got off to?
So she had to run out to her car. She'd be right back.
Well, with that said, then let me just ask, is council, we're good with the 3.5%? No more questions in that area? We're okay with staff recommendation? Okay, very good. So Carter, with that, if you'd like to move on in your presentation, if you will.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Yes,
Thanks
sir.
for hanging in there, everybody. I appreciate it. I mentioned that I've done, this is now my 19th budget. When I first started here, however, my job was to sit right there, kind of where Zelena's sitting right now, and fill up the popcorn bowls and so forth for the table for the council of the day. Councilor Bertolio.
Why do we not have a popcorn guy?
Somehow that went away. I don't know what happened, but I think Pete had to do that too once back in
You were the
history.
popcorn man?
I went, I did a period, just did.
No kidding.
I didn't do very well.
A keto Pete delving out popcorn.
Yeah,
The thought of it.
that was 25 years ago. So, this room has been the host for budget meetings for probably 40 years. And you guys are the last ones to do the budget in this room forever.
Yeah, we'll be across the hall next.
That's right. This will be the last council to sit in this room to talk about this topic.
They signed a paneling?
And this paneling has been the,
Witness, yeah.
the witness to all those close dealings. Yeah, that's right.
When they go to scrub the
Panel
crime off the
talk,
wall,
yeah.
the marker will just come off with it. Well, actually, next year, we won't do budget across there either. We'll be doing it at Derrick more than likely.
Yeah, that's right, probably. Yeah, that's right. So I gotta tell you, when I was sitting there watching budgets then, 25 years ago, they were so boring.
It hasn't changed much. It might
I don't feel like they're all that boring at all.
It might feel better because you're talking, but it's really no different. If anybody's actually tuned in, I would really be shocked.
I will tell you though, meaning no offense to anybody, you guys are engaged in this conversation in a very healthy, productive way, and I really appreciate that. So keep up the good work. We're gonna do it together, right? For the last time in this room. Excuse me, sorry. And it's an honor, actually, to be that person that gets to do that with you tonight.
Well, that's kind of you to say.
The general fund. So we talked a lot about influencing factors resulting in the development of the budget proposal for the general fund. I thought it might help to kind of worksheet the entire fund with you so you can see how all the revenues and expenditures compare to each other. And then we'll go through each of the enterprise funds in a very similar way. And then we'll talk about subsidies because that's an important part of your collective interest, if you will, and hopefully we'll cover it to your satisfaction. This is what we are anticipating from a revenue standpoint, cash standpoint in the general fund. We believe that at the end of all the restrictions and the primary corpus of reserves that represents 120 days of the operations of the general fund, you'll still have $1.5 million in the fund balance of the general fund. Now, to kind of get to the punchline, we're not representing any proposals that will spend that money, okay? But we're also not representing anything at this point in time that would grow that balance either. And here in a minute, you'll see why that's important to recognize. But let's look at the revenue and the expenses. We're anticipating, as I had mentioned earlier, this is a $53 million business enterprise, if you will, governmental enterprise of your overall operation, one of your largest areas of revenue and expenses. So what you're going to see here is expenses that match your revenues, and that's always the good news, right? We're not going to have to draw upon your reserves or anything like that. One quick note, this figure right here has actually grown since the time we put that figure together, at least by way of commitment that we got recently. We're anticipating another 90,000, is that right, Jill, into the opioid piece? Is it 90?
It's
Yep.
right around.
Somewhere in that neighborhood, okay.
And we also have a commitment from the county to match us dollar for dollar on that when we get to the point of implementation.
Yep, that's a good news segment there. So bringing up the expenses if we could. Your operational expenses are here. You got new positions that we had referenced earlier. Let's hit the next slide if we could. The bottom line is your total expenditures will match your revenues, thanks to the good work of your departments to get us to that point in terms of working out all the expenses. And of course, we're very grateful that we have some revenue working our way to make all that happen. The real bottom line is, though, as I had mentioned, the next slide, please, we really aren't going to have any additional cash, however, to add back into the fund balance of the general fund. That figure is going to remain static, and that'll be something I point to throughout the next fiscal year, in that that does not represent a real good margin as it relates to projects that come up throughout the fiscal year or other expenses that we may not have anticipated. When we talk about Budget Amendment 3 coming up, you're going to understand why this margin is really critical. So if we could hit the next slide here. Yeah, let's do one more. When you consider the amount of money that we have sort of held in abeyance in the general fund, you can see, proportionately speaking, that 1.5 does not represent a whole lot of wiggle room for things we may not have anticipated. So I'm hopeful that that balance can grow over time. That happens with respect to money that we don't spend in the current fiscal year. That happens with respect to surplus revenue we may somehow get. We're not projecting a lot either way. So that balance we'll need to keep an eye on in terms of the fluidity the general fund represents, and that's not that much.
And any budget amendments you bring us over that fiscal year come from that, correct?
Well, Mr. Mayor, sometimes that's the case. Certainly, when it comes to Budget Amendment 3, and Public Safety is going to help walk us through that next week, I should say in 2 weeks, you'll see how we will apply some of that funding, although that margin is a little different with respect to current position right now, and how those help their operations. But that's not always what we recommend in terms of amendments that we need to bother you with. Sometimes it certainly is, though. Okay? Important graphic to be aware of, though, as we go into the new fiscal year for the general fund. Let's talk about capital here. Again, I probably sound like a broken record, but I want to be clear. We are not going to bring you a proposal that doesn't have cash on hand to do your projects. Next year, for example, we're going to tell you probably that we need $17 million from 1 cent 17 to do a whole host of projects, a lot of which will be streets and so on. You will have that recommendation because we have collected $17 million worth of 1 cent 17 receipts throughout the next 12 months. Okay, that's what that means. If we collect less, say it's 16 or 15, we will bring you a budget for 16 or 15, not 17, right? That's how that works, and I appreciate the transition, if you will, into that model a few years back. Let's talk about what we're doing here, though. A lot of question that we get as it relates to 1 cent, and this is typically very prevalent when it's election time for 1 cent, is the idea that we use 1 cent for raises. It's the idea that we use 1 cent to hire cops and firefighters and all sorts of hosts of accusations. The reality is, however, if we could hit the next slide. This is what we spend 1 cent money on. It's streets, it's pipes, it's building repairs and those kinds of things. You have told us, however, that you also want to see some 1 cent money built into the Aquatic Center Fund to help keep prices at the pool low. And we have followed that order. You have also told us to use 1 cent money to keep prices on the bus low in order for folks to use transportation, public transit. We have followed that direction now for probably, I don't know, Liz, how long would you say? 10 years? Easily 10 years, okay. So we have not abandoned any of that direction, nor have we built any other direction beyond what you've told us to do. Looking at how it all breaks out for the $47 million that we're asking for from you to do capital next year, obviously that's more than what 1 cent provides. We'll show you how it breaks out. This is what it looks like. We've got heavy equipment, we've got light equipment, we've got streets, pipes and tanks. The difference, one of the primary differences, I should say a couple primary differences as it relates to 1 cent 17 and 1 cent 16. You actually are spending more money on streets in 1 cent 17 than you were in 1 cent 16. And that, I think that's a positive accomplishment. The problem is that the cost for doing projects does not get us as many street miles as it has previously. And so accordingly, we're not really improving our grade, as it were, even with this heightened investment. And that's regrettable. And hopefully that reverses course at some point in the future. I don't know if it will or not, but I'm hopeful that that could potentially be something wonderful for us to experience here soon.
Looking at this graph and the one before, don't we also subsidize our constituent city water and sewer bills with 1 cent funding as well, which I haven't seen it on any of the graphs yet.
$3 million a year.
That is primarily with regard to the pipes and tanks and plant upgrades that we consider. Now, we're lucky in this year that we got some other funding from SLIB
yeah.
and ARPA and those kinds of things to help us with some of the water treatment plant upgrades. But primarily where you're seeing it is right here in pipes. We do a lot of pipe with 1 cent. That would be the second difference that I would identify for you between 1 cent 16 and 1 cent 17. 1 cent 17 actually projects a lower allocation to water and sewer, not by a whole lot, but certainly by some, for the next 4 years. And so the question you have to ask yourself, and you'll see this demonstrated a little bit later on here, is whether or not you want to make up that difference with regard to rate revenue or other grants and those kinds of things to try to keep your capital agenda fairly consistent over time. Because as you remember, capital for water and sewer is predicated upon what is available through 1 cent, but it's also what's available through reserves, what's available through rates, and what you might funnel into capital from that program. And or we just don't do it, right? So when you lose revenue and you want to maintain that capital, agenda, if you will, that's always a question. Where does that replacement revenue come from? And you have that for the next 4 years, essentially. Although not by a large degree. In fact, do y'all remember the actual subsidy that's divided out between water and sewer and how that compares? If you don't mind, Mr. Mayor?
Not at all.
Carter Council, I think 1 cent 16, we had 12 million allocated to water and sewer. And I think 1/17 is 10.6, 10.4 million.
So over 4 years, that's not a huge difference, but still, it's a difference.
But considering inflation and everything else, it's probably more of a substantial difference than we're thinking.
I think that's probably fair. But as far as for the project perspective, that's how it looks. Nothing really new to you because you've dedicated a lot of time thus far to capital. From a funding perspective, here's how it breaks out. Be the next slide. Right here. Again, remember that we are transferring dollars out of some of these pots of money into the capital fund, which is what you're seeing here and what you're seeing here. We really don't have this fund in FY24. When you transfer that funding out into the capital fund, that essentially depletes your CARES ARPA fund. And we knew that. We expected that because that's just kind of a one-time clearinghouse for those kinds of dollars. We will now empty that and we will reduce this to the extent that the remaining 1 cent $16 will be almost the exact same figure in the neighborhood of 5.6 that you will have in the opportunity fund when we get to this point next year, assuming we don't spend any more on projects that aren't budgeted right now, or overages or those kinds of things. So that's how your funding works out for your $47 million capital agenda. Your enterprise funds. You also spend a lot of time on your enterprise funds throughout any given year. We have rate hearings, officially once every 2 years. In the interim year, we also bring those back to you to make sure we're on track with what we've told you we thought we would be doing, so you can see the pro formas and how they're actually performing and those kinds of things. So you spend a lot of time right here. And this, unlike the general fund, you have 100% control and say with regard to how these funds react and perform and everything else. Because you get to determine how rates figure in, you get to determine how 1 cent will play a role, you get to determine what grants we pursue. You got 100% control, so to speak, versus the 23% in the general fund. It's a dramatic difference. These are your business enterprises without a doubt. Let's look at your water. When it comes to rates, we often get the criticism that we're raising rates to, in a real similar fashion to, do raises, to buy cops, to buy firefighters, to buy clerical staff, all that kind of thing in the general fund. Not the case. Whenever we bring a rate proposal to you, it is really only to deal with the costs and the trajectories and the trends that we're seeing with respect to that individual fund. And I'm being emphatic about that because you will likely need to consider rates in FY24, probably November, when we have our official rate hearings coming up at the end of the calendar year. Which for some of you, that's going to be your first. For others of you, this is going to be one of several that you've gone through. But nonetheless, they're never easy, unless we are proposing no rates. And that happens to be one of my favorite times. We're not talking about rate increases, but I don't think we're going to get away with that for every one of these funds, as you will soon see here. The water fund is actually doing quite well. This is what we showed you back during the rate hearing process or update earlier last fiscal year, current fiscal year, right? Now, what you're seeing is what we're about to show you when you hit the next slide. This dash line, okay? Remember, the blue line is actual performance, or I should say proposed performance, right? Your green line is kind of your warning track as it relates to staying away from this black line. The black line is when you start dipping into reserves. When you cross the black line, you're dipping into reserves. When you cross this line, it's bold and red for a reason, you're actually going broke. So you've got a warning track right here, you've got reserve demarcation right here, and you've got no money, as indicated by the zero, cross down there. Okay? If anything, aside from, to discuss that argument again about subsidies, the water fund does not subsidize other funds. However, as you have all correctly identified, 1% legitimately subsidizes water and sewer. Okay? Because of 1%. I mean, you've made that determination, it's appropriate, but that is a subsidy. Unlike what people often accuse us of this going the other way. It's not the case. Okay? We believe the water fund is performing better than what we thought it would do back in December or whenever it was that we brought this original projection to you in the form of this blue curve. Okay? I think the water fund is performing in a rather optimal condition right now.
Is that due to increased water sales? What is it?
It's due to good water sales. It's due to
Better investments, obviously.
Yep. Interest income is playing a good role here. Absolutely. We have not seen project costs for this beyond what we have been willing to support with capital money that's available. We've tried to stake within those boundaries, if you will. In other words, we haven't really planned for that kind of a dip or whatever for the water fund. We are staying within our means, is in fact beyond our means, if you will, a little bit, anytime we operate above here. Okay?
So, just to be really clear for me. for you,
Sure,
Mayor.
no problem.
So, when you say water fund, you're talking about, that's the total cost of that service?
That's exactly right.
Okay.
The question was, when we talk about water fund, and frankly any of the other funds, we're talking about the fund that's created to support the business enterprise related to water. Okay? Laying pipe and transmitting water. We buy water from regional water through this fund so we can sell it back to our customers. We are a wholesale buyer from regional water, hence the reason we kind of talked about that little rate discussion earlier. When regional water raises rates, it's paid for and incurred primarily here, and then we try to sell that water back to our customers and recoup that cost.
Carter, truthfully, if this continues to perform the way it is, we may not have to have a rate increase in November.
Yeah, unless something happens, Mr. Mayor, this summer that would indicate our behavior curve responding in a way we didn't expect. I don't know that I could propose rates like this unless, of course, we've got some sort of capital agenda that without those rates would cause this curve to drop down like that.
Sure.
And that's what we often have to be careful of, those assumptions that build those long-term
We'll know come
actions.
November.
Yeah, absolutely, we will.
Kyle?
Thanks, Bruce. I'll have the opportunity to get on my soapbox more in November when we talk about rates again, but I was curious, and maybe this is a question for Andrew, do we have, like streets, any sort of assessment or idea of what the general condition is of our pipes and whether they are remaining in a neutral position, whether they're getting worse over time? As a reminder, we replace them at a rate of 0.05%, I believe, water mains every 200 years, so I was just curious.
Mayor, Council, we do have a very good indication of the quality of the material in the ground. But keep in mind that this model that you're showing here already includes a 7% proposed rate increase. So if you go to zero, that line changes drastically. So this is already built in 7% for the next several years.
What is the percent?
7.
7?
So
And so you said we do have an idea of the condition of our pipes.
we've got, in our system, we still have some 4-inch pipe in the ground, which is old cast iron. We still got a lot of ductile iron pipe and highly corrosive soils that we know we're gonna have to replace.
Are our pipes getting worse over time, or are they
Mayor,
average condition?
Counselor, With the newer pipe, we don't have a good life history of that material. PVC pipe and HDPE pipe, which we have started using more and more of here in the last decade. But generally, I'd say they're probably getting worse.
Like streets. Well, hopefully not with this next cycle, but we'll maintain. But that's what I was asking about, like, I'm great to see this, this fund performing very well, but if it's based on a model that is unrealistically optimistic, it still means our pipes are getting worse over time, like our streets and our sewer and everything else. And so, again, I'll have an opportunity to get on my soapbox in 6 months again, but just something for this council to keep in mind.
But don't you think it's a fair assessment regardless of what we're talking about, whether it's pipes or streets or buildings? I mean, everything deteriorates over time. It's just a natural attrition. It's the way it is. And I would assume that's partially built into these models through the 7% increase is what I'm guessing that's for, correct? Sir?
Mayor. Sir. Councilor. Certainly it includes the capital agenda that we've got out for the next 5 years, which includes replacing some of that, those deficient pipelines. Keep in mind that we've still got a lot of projects that we're chasing with YDOT. You know, First and Poplar still has not been let. You know, we've got some work on the interstate that we're gonna have to chase in the upcoming years. So we're having to postpone some of our own capital to accommodate some YDOT capital, if that makes sense.
So does that money sit and wait then, or does it get allocated to other projects?
Mayor, council, it essentially gets reallocated to YDOT and those other projects get postponed.
It just wait.
Gotcha. Yes, sir, Mr. Bond.
Mayor, I just wanted to clarify, I heard a 7% number thrown out. Was that 7%, was that a percent rate increase per year average? Is that where we're?
Mayor, councilor, that's correct.
Okay, thank you. I just wanted to make sure that was understood that correctly.
But Mr. Mayor, just to be clear, Counselor,
Yes.
that does not mean that you don't get to change the factors that influence the way this curve reacts over time.
Sure.
And that also, particularly for the water fund, is really contingent upon what we have to buy water for. So whatever that wholesale price is, influences a lot of what we spend out of this fund as well.
And I can tell you at our last meeting, which will be ratified next month, our board is considering a 2 cent per 1,000 gallon raise, a 1% raise, which amounts to 2 cents per 1,000. I'm of course voting no against that, but I think I'm the only one that is. So, just so you're aware. And I will keep pounding that until that day.
Well, and Mr. Mayor, those kinds of factors will be clear to us by the time we get to November, where we can offer you a
Correct.
lot more insight than we're prepared to offer you tonight. That's for sure. We've just got a general projection, but I am pretty pleased
I'm making my point.
with regard to that purple line and what it represents in terms of our current activity. It's good news. Good news. Let's see the worksheet then for how water breaks out if we could. The general synopsis is, as you saw in that decline of the behavior line, we are anticipating some expenditure of those dollars on hand to the point that we will see a little bit of a decrease in respect to the available cash left in the water fund. Hence the reason, again, you're seeing that decline. We're kind of burning those balances over and above the green line a little bit to where our final figure at the end and as far as the cash available for the fund over and above your reserves is that figure to start fiscal year 25. And again, that'll be really contingent upon what you do in November and where you want to see those balances shake out, what capital you want to pursue. I mean, there's just a whole lot to consider in November. That could determine and impact how that figure looks and of course your expenses and everything else. Okay? That's your water fund. Let's look at the sewer fund. The sewer fund, I mean, this represents more your distribution, your transmission, if you will, for the fund. This is what we showed you late last year as to what we thought would happen if you'll observe your blue line here. When you look at what's actually going on in the form of that dashed line, you can see we are performing almost exactly like what we thought would happen, nearly a year ago or whatever, number of months ago. Okay, so I'm real happy with regard to what the sewer fund's doing here. This too will be something you'll have a lot more in-depth conversation on as we get toward the end of the calendar year. This looks, this is as close to being exactly what you were looking for as any fund that you would see.
Does that also include a 7% projected?
Certainly when you're talking about the behavior of the curves going this way, not only are we assuming some level of rate increase over time, we're also assuming some level of capital agenda over time as well. The factors of which you get to control either way moving forward. But yeah, for a moderate sort of approach, this is what we've built to try to give you that overview, but you get to determine how that looks.
Very good.
Starting in November, right? Refuse and bale fill. Wait a minute, before we get there, here's the worksheet for sewer, okay? You can see a burning down, if you will, of some of those. Anytime you see that curve going downward, it's usually because of some expense on the capital side that pulls some of those dollars out of that, those extra balances in order to get us some capital done. That's the case here, to the point that you're seeing an ending balance in fiscal year 25 to work with of $1.4 million. For this size of a fund, that's a real decent balance to work with, as indicated by the position of your blue line and your dashed purple line above both of your sort of demarcation lines over your reserves. That's good news. That's very good news. Looking at, yes,
Go ahead.
Sorry.
Please.
Sorry.
That's quite all right.
Switch back.
And again, the health of this fund, the model that it's based off of, the expectation is that we're replacing our sewer mains at a rate of 0.03% every 300 years, correct, Andrew?
Mayor, Councilor, that is correct.
Okay. Would you have similar comments in regards to this fund as you did to the water fund?
Mayor, Councilor, I would.
Thank you.
So you're just saying the same thing over and over, Andrew?
That's the same question.
Touche.
Is he getting saucy or what?
I think you could tell he's really on a short leash here. He just doesn't even care anymore. And I take that back. I know that you do, so.
Short timer.
Kind of. Thank you, Mr. Beamer.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Beaver. All right, refuse. Let's talk about refuse. Refuse and bale fill. They have a really interesting relationship, right? Refuse fund represents, if you recall, the activities that we undertake to provide customers curbside service. We've got residential customers, we've got commercial customers. But they are our curbside customers. We charge them a fee to do, to take away their garbage. And then we pay a tipping fee at the bale fill in order to dump all that garbage into the landfill and run it through the baler and everything else, right? That's the purpose of this fund, to accommodate our curbside business. And so when we talked in December, November timeframe last year, we knew that we were going to have a foray into reserves. We were going to leverage our reserves to deal with some business factors of this fund that are fairly unique to this fund, and in my estimation, just intrinsically tied to some of the effects of the pandemic. We really struggle with refuse and bale fill as a result of the activities that we did not anticipate pursuant to some of the customer behaviors in these operations. It was really interesting. The passes is a great example of that. Passes operate kind of like a bank. When you get a run on the bank, because everybody wants to take out their money at the same time, banks get a little nervous. When we have every citizen in the community wanting to use their passes, we get similarly nervous because we build that business model assuming that will never happen. That did happen, actually. during the pandemic. And we're still recovering. Cindy, what else would you attribute this foray into the?
Your Honor, Council people, the cost of trash trucks has gone up significantly, and during the pandemic, we weren't receiving them after 2 years. That hasn't changed, unfortunately, like some of the other things. So the deferred maintenance, Carter, is significant in this fund for our trash trucks. But he's correct. The tipping fees, trash truck costs, and personnel are the three biggest factors in this fund. We don't have pipes, so you don't have to ask me about pipes.
No, but you have cells.
The landfill does. This fund does not. This fund is just the service, just like he says. They pick up trash. That's what they do. Then they take it to the landfill, and that's a different fund.
How do you feel about that, Andrew?
Council, I think she's correct.
And they'll last for 400 years.
I don't have any sweet stuff.
Passes. Where did that come into play? Was that a deduct from this or an additional cost into the bail fill?
Your Honor, councilors, that's a really good question. So because we had this flood of residential people not working and wanting to clean up their house using their passes, this fund gets charged for those passes from the landfill.
Okay.
The airspace is taken up. So, we do it on an average, well, that cost exponentially went up, so it really hurt this fund,
Okay.
so.
Well, I can also tell you, and I know this to be factual, during COVID, we were not stamping those passes. So people could literally use the same passes over and over and over again, and they were using them over and over again. So that also hurt us, but with the unknowns of COVID, nobody wanted to touch and pass back and forth. So that was an anomaly. It was something that we hope we never see again in our lifetime. But Carter, with that said, it looks like the projected pro forma is very good, based on the data that you have.
And the preview that Fleur gave you here just a second ago, yes, that's right. That purple dash line would indicate that it's actually performing a little better than we expected in the refuse fund. And that's great. That's good news. Be mindful though, given what we're about to talk about in the bail fill side of this whole equation, in order to keep this fund performing in a trajectory that is very positive like this, you will have to do something with respect to curbside rates if you only dealt on the tipping fee side, because that would push this behavior dramatically downward very, very quickly. So keep that in mind. It looks good now, without a doubt. And but it could turn quickly if indeed we don't manage both funds in the harmony that they are designed to work with each other. Okay. Laying out the worksheet for the refuse fund, you will see here that we actually add a little cash to the bottom line as far as available cash is concerned at the end of the fiscal year. Certainly this would be indicative quite differently if indeed we raise fees on the side of the bail fill and not do anything in response on this side as well. So while 315 doesn't sound like a lot when you're talking about the size of this fund and the fact that we're actually recovering out of the reserves, all that is good news in my opinion. Particularly when we thought we'd be in a worse position a year ago than we actually are. Okay? We have some deeper analysis so we need to provide you by way of the bail fill. Okay? Let's go ahead and go to the bail fill here. We took a little bit of a different approach as it relates to this green line here. In most cases, with the other funds and so forth, The green line is really only meant to represent sort of a warning indicator that you're getting close to reserves, okay? It's kind of like when you're playing baseball and you're trying to back up for a pop hit out to the outfield, and you feel your feet going on a different surface. That's a warning track, because then you know you're going to hit the fence soon. You're not paying attention, you're keeping an eye on the ball. That's all this green line is meant to be in most funds. However, you asked that this line represent what some of our longer-term capital goals should reflect. And in this case, it would mean creating a new landfill cell, because that is a big investment. Not only is that a big investment to dig that big hole and put liner in and all that kind of thing, you got to close portions of the other cell that you're sort of abandoning, if you will. And that costs money too, because we've got closures that DEQ requires and steps you got to take and systems you got to put in. I mean, it's just it's a capital intensive operation when it comes to burying trash. Even if you're doing it as efficiently as we are with big cubes and stuff like that, right? And so this green line really is meant to represent for the bale fill your capital goals that you need to consider between now and, in our case, 2030, because that's when we need to start building another cell. We're kind of wrapping up a current construction right now. Cell number 6 will need to come online around 2030, and we need to have this level of capital savings, if you will, in order to save up for that level of investment that we're going to need to make in about 7 years. Okay? So the green line represents something a little different here, all right? Undoubtedly, the blue line needs to obviously catch up with that over time so that we're saving appropriately. Because these things are going to cost us about $6 or $7 million by the time we get to 2030, if not more. And then closing a cell is going to have another $1 million or more obligation to it as well. That's our best guess right now. If you look at what it is that we are actually doing in 2024, thank you, we're anticipating a little bit of a deeper dive than we expected, several months ago. So from my perspective, this is not an acceptable behavior, because we're diving below the black line. We're going to, of course, suggest some measures that keep our foray below the black line limited, and then get us back on track to trying to perform at this level so we can start saving some money. Because right now we're burning reserves. And that is a red flag condition for us.
Kyle.
Thanks, Bruce. Thanks, Carter. Do we have any indication why it's underperforming? Is it a result of reduced commercial usage at the bale fill? Is it a result of still increased residential usage at in the refuse fund? Combination? I'm curious.
Or is it residual from COVID still?
I think all of that is true. And we've conducted some additional analysis that we can share with you right now. If we could switch slides for you. Let's go past this for now, right now. One more. Yeah, right there. This really is the difference, okay? And Cindy can give us way more detail than I can as to what this means. But basically speaking, we anticipated a revenue activity, performance, or whatever that would be represented by this graphic right there. What we're actually seeing, however, is more in line with what we've experienced on sort of an average basis over time, historically, okay? So we expected this, we're getting this, and we're proposing this for fiscal year 24. Now, as to some of the differences as to why we're seeing that figure versus what we hope to get is told with this graphic here. This is the story right here. And as you can see, the difference would be this figure right here, okay? This is what we are experiencing. This ghost version of this line is what we were hoping to get. And that indicates the largest portion of deficits that we're seeing in terms of unrealized revenue right now. And that's in the category of commercial charges. We're simply not seeing the amount of commercial revenue that we thought we would be this time last year. Okay? Can I ask Cindy to give us some insight into that dynamic? Is that all right? Thank you.
Your Honor, counselors. So, you mentioned COVID. If you notice those lines since 22, we're dropping back down there. We were really hoping and projecting this year that we would go pre-COVID with our commercial customers. Not only does that include, restaurants not doing as well and hotels not doing as well yet. We're still not getting as much revenue from some of those COVID situations, but oil and gas has not returned. And that was pre-COVID. We were getting some really good revenue from the oil and gas industry. And I attribute most of it to not seeing those kind of customers right now. So when you have $1 million drop in revenue from one particular industry, it really hurts this fund. So, and we are seeing the same things as refuse and the other enterprise funds. Equipment has gone up. We don't have 2-year waits for red iron landfill equipment. It's more like a little more than a year, but they're coming in a year, so we don't have as much deferred maintenance. We bought a lot of used equipment in the past, so it's kind of beyond its livable years, so we are experiencing some of that too.
Steve?
By the oil field revenue, are you talking about basically the trash baskets and things from the drilling rigs and the construction projects?
Your Honor, counselors, that and special waste, like contaminated soil and bringing in all their hazardous waste, all that kind of stuff. So it's everything. It's not just their field trash, it's everything that they bring in.
God bless you. Thank you, Cindy.
For the environment, not for the sound.
So the basic thrust. Okay. Yeah. Thank you. There we go. Appreciate that. The basic thrust behind the story that this tells is it's just simply a demonstration of revenue that we just simply didn't get. That we thought we would. That's had major effects with regard to how this fund performs, particularly when you couple it with some of the increased expenses that this revenue is not there to match necessarily. And so what we are having to do right now is reimagine what it is that we'll do with this fund. If I could switch back to that line graph. Yeah, keep going. There we go. In order to get our experience below the black line as short as possible. And that will be the challenge you need to consider coming up in November. This, in fact, will probably be the biggest challenge that you'll have to consider coming up in November, because I'm sure you're not, I'm sure you're feeling the angst that I am, and Cindy and Andrew are, and everything else with this operating like this, without some sort of prospect of when we start getting back in this part of our real estate here and get consistent with that green line, because we've got to start saving money for the next sell. And unfortunately, it's going to be a heavy lift in order to get there in a reasonable amount of time.
Amber?
Thanks for moving that green line for me.
My pleasure.
I'm assuming that the rate increases is, come November, that's what we're gonna be looking at. That's how we're gonna get that back up there, correct? That's
That is your biggest question coming up in November, yeah, because you've got rates, or you can reduce capital. And the problem with that is if you're reducing capital, then we're back into the deferred maintenance situation that is costing us more per piece of equipment than it should when you get to the point of needing to replace that piece, right? So you've got a couple of those dynamics in play. This is not one of your funds, however, that receives 1 cent money to try to help buoy some of those issues.
Sir?
Thank you, Mayor. Carter or Cindy, can you talk a little bit, and maybe you did and I missed it, but that state grants revenue on that other slide?
Switch back to that with the multiple lines.
Yeah, that one.
That's it, thank you.
Can you talk about that a little bit? Or did you and I missed it, or?
This one right here.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's the FY the deficit, state grants.
You want to talk?
You're,
Go ahead.
absolutely. Your Honor, counselors, those are related to the landfill remediation program. We have an agreement with the state, because we do have contaminants from our old unlined landfill that are going into the North Platte River. So we have two grants. We have the standard grant that all the other leaking landfills have, where they pay 75%, the state does, for our costs to monitor it, put in remedies, those kind of things. And then 25% grant that's called the credit that we got for doing things ahead of the state asking us to do it to prevent some of the pollution. So on this deficit is actually just sitting there. It's in anticipation of a cost estimate that Alex and I worked on together for an old landfill, which is South Metro Road. That old area that, for those folks who've been here forever like me, it was the very old landfill. Anyway, we've estimated to do a remedy, it would be 2.1. We know today we're negotiating and working with them on trying to get that down, but those monies are offset by them paying 100% to us. So I used to, in the old days when he was giving popcorn, I never even gave this information to council if it was offset. It was just a cash flow issue, and I go, yeah, it's confusing to people when you show this big amount of money because the state is paying for 100% of that. So, but Alex and I are negotiating with the state. It's interesting when they have to pay the bill, how the negotiations change when we're paying the bill. So it's been a very long, tedious process, but we're getting that number down right now. So it shouldn't be an issue related to this.
As a follow-up. So is that deficit affecting the projections, and that doesn't have any impact there? Okay.
No.
Okay.
Because when we don't realize the grant, we don't realize the expense for the associated project.
Sure. Okay.
Okay, so it's a little misleading in terms of,
Sure. That's
you
good to
know, making you think it's part of the problem. Unless we'd incurred the project and for whatever reason we didn't get the grant.
And we wouldn't do that.
Yeah, we would not
get
do
100% in writing that they're gonna pay for it before we do it.
Right.
That's why it's so challenging.
You concur, Mr. Beamer?
Mayor, council, I would concur that this fund is in not very good shape. That is what I'm concerned.
I'm assuming though, come November, we'll have a remedy for that, or you will. You'll come to the table with a remedy for us.
Absolutely.
I mean, that's,
It won't be easy, but it
Well,
will be a remedy.
so far, everything has been pretty easy, so a little bit of difficulty isn't gonna hurt anybody. We'll figure it out. Go ahead, Steve.
And part
Thank
of
you,
this remediation that you're talking about with this grant is part of why we made the purchase of that land from
Yep.
Knife
whoever
River.
it was down there, from Knife River down there. Okay.
You're absolutely
Lake
correct.
McKenzie, yes.
Yep, because then we could control the mitigation
Right.
aspects that we'd pursue.
But
Absolutely.
I was trying to tie those two things together, so.
100% correct. 100%. Could we shift to the 10-year prospectus? This is actually a 10-year look at where we're going, keeping in mind that, you know, the sooner we get here, the better we have in terms of controlling our destiny to be at that point on time, right? And being ready to build the next cell. So this is a 10-year outlook. You can tell that it's longer because we're, you know, looking at that current year being really short compared to the rest. We've got a 10-year plan here, but it is going to take a heavier lift than we anticipated a year ago.
Well, just for the model's sake, what do you have projected in there, percentage-wise, to get you there?
You know, generally when we talk about tipping fees, we talk about the dollars that we would increase the tipping fee by to get us to that point. We aren't prepared with a recommendation necessarily, but I would tell you that you know, in order to get to this point, we are probably going to have to eventually consider a $100 tipping fee, unless activity here performs way better than we're expecting right now, right? Which would offset the need for that dramatic of a tipping fee increase.
And explain what a $100 tipping fee would mean.
That would mean that every time I take a ton of refuse to the bale fill and I step onto that scale of my vehicle that has that ton of refuse, I'm gonna get charged $100 instead of the, what is it current? 55 that we're experiencing right now. Assuming our activity does not return in a manner that helps us offset a lot of those increases.
Steve?
I would not anticipate the oil field revenue recovering because most of the places have gone to closed systems, which means we have to dispose of the cuttings, which was part of your revenue. And there are other places in private business that are now taking it for even less than your $55 a ton tipping fee. So that's why that hasn't recovered, and I would not anticipate it recovering, just as a heads up.
Sure.
Okay?
Well, I
I'm
will
sure
tell
you already were aware of that, but.
If drilling operations resume in Natrona County, you'll have it back. The problem is there, you have places like Republic and all those that are in the Powder River, which is where all the drilling is going on right now, so they take it there. Logistically, it doesn't make sense to bring it all the way to Casper. But if they started doing it again in Natrona County, you would start getting it back again. So it's just a matter of, but I mean, we'd need a whole different administration to allow us to drill. Go ahead.
Are prices comparable?
Yeah. Actually, Republic's a little more expensive than we are. So, and see, part of the problem is also, there's an advantage to bringing it to the city because we have lined pits now, our cells are, where we dump that. And whether you believe it or not, the oil company, if they bring cuttings that are contaminated to the city and the city's liner fails, it's not just the city that's on the hook for those cuttings, it's the oil company that brought them also, even though they had given them to the city and the liner, was supposed to hold it. It's the same thing with Republic when they take them there. If something happened and Republic stuff leaked into a water system, they can go all the way back to the oil company, even though they paid for it and washed their hands of it, they're still on the hook for it. So the advantage to bringing it to our landfill is the security measures. The EPA is heavily involved with us, and it's fairly secure. So it is an advantage for them to bring it here. Just logistically, it's not, because they're in a completely different county. So, and I don't know if and when we'll ever drill here again. Who knows? We would need a different administration in order for that to happen. So like you said, it's you can't count on it, and it is what it is. So we'll just rate them up. I mean, and we're all going to feel it, but I don't know what choice we would have. Do you?
The only way that I see that not happening is if the activity in this operation just improves dramatically than we can see right now. And in that case, where we get a lot of those specialized waste, where we have really good margins, we may not need to consider as dramatic an increase, but that really is contingent upon a future that's hard for us to see right now.
Do we see any of the other smaller outlying, any more of the outlying communities trying to bring their refuse to us?
Your Honor, councilors, not in the short term. And my staff's recommended some other things to me too to get revenue.
Okay.
That would absolutely be one, is to go out and market it ourselves, which we don't do. We have got a call from Idaho to start bringing in their wind turbine blades, which is the media here.
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
I shouldn't have told you that, but we do have to modify our permit with UQ to take out of state waste. But there are some things that, we could come to you and say, hey, we could get revenue from out of state on different kinds of waste types. So there are some things, when we say we're gonna bring you some ideas, that definitely we'll be talking to Carter about.
But if it comes to our constituents paying a $100 tipping fee or allowing waste to come in from out of state, be interesting to see. Go ahead.
Thanks, Bruce. I have no problem saying I'm a big fan of the turbine blade disposal, so I would, I'll take the heat for you on that one.
Okay.
I would concur with the mayor that if it's the choice between increasing our tip and fee 100%, 200%, or taking in turbine blades, which are non-toxic, which are inert, which there's little to no risk of environmental contamination, that's an easy decision for me.
Agreed. Agreed.
Well, and Mr. Mayor, even if it did have environmental contamination, we are equipped to deal with that.
Correct.
And in those situations, we have great margins. And so when we get those kinds of wastes, we actually are sort of subsidizing what it is we have to pay at the curb, which is a very nice situation. And I would further say, we have been positioned in a really effective manner wherein we have customers that are outside of our jurisdiction. That is a unique feature as it relates to most of the regional landfills around the state. And so I'm really grateful for the shoulders we're able to stand on right now because of those decisions that have been made in the past. Because this situation could look a lot worse were it not for those kinds of broader-based customers that we can rely upon.
Amen. Cindy, thank you very much.
Any other questions about any of your enterprises?
See you in November.
Yes, absolutely. Let's talk about subsidies.
Where is she?
She's hiding over there.
I think she fell asleep.
Anxiously awaiting.
She's awake now.
Yes, she is gonna be.
This is a comparative sort of table that Zalim and her team and finance put together with regard to a grand overview of all of the subsidies that we're about to break down for you here compared year to year. Okay? Numerical form, obviously. Let's talk about each of the funds that these represent. All right? The golf course, as we've mentioned before, happens to be one of our recreational enterprises that actually covers its own when it comes to operations, as well as some capital. Not all of it, right? But some, and certainly all of the operations, which is why you see this blue line operating above this red line right here. When the blue line is above that, that means or I should say above the green. The red represents kind of our goal, if you will. When it's operating above the green line, we're actually making a little money. Okay? When it's operating above the red line, then we're making you happy because we've met your goal as to what this fund should be doing. We are anticipating that happening for fiscal year 24. As you can see here, it would be wonderful if we saw the 115% that we're proposing, and that's what we're shooting for. We've got a couple things working in our favor in that way, and I'm optimistic that we'll get there.
Mr. G.
Thanks, Bruce. Thanks, Carter. To go back to your earlier point that this only includes some capital from fiscal year 18 to fiscal year 24, do we have any idea how much capital was required at the golf course? To me, it helps to understand. I'm stoked to hear that it covers operations, but I've still had a hard time wrapping my head around, on my 2 years on council, how much capital is required at the golf course, and when you add that into the equation, how well does the golf course perform with operations and capital included?
Yeah. Mr. Mayor, Councilor, that's a fair question. Generally speaking, when we were sort of bringing down these this activity and so forth, we were trying to do some improvements to the facility that would help it be more solvent as a revenue center. And I will tell you that has helped a ton. We've got a really good concession out there at the 19th hole, working really well. I hope that relationship never changes, frankly. The Johnson Group is a great partner. But we had to do some things from a capital investment standpoint that helped us get a little more life out of the clubhouse. We still have a number of investments that we got to do out there. If we don't replace the whole dang thing, the whole facility. And so, we've got some life in it left, but the time will come eventually when we need to really consider whether or not that place should be replaced. That's one example.
And to be 100% transparent, this isn't really, From an operational standpoint, the chart is fair, but realistically, it's not. We just took $500,000 out of our capital to buy golf carts for them. And if that was figured into that particular operation, it's losing money. So, I mean, it's just not realistic the way it's set up, in my opinion. Because golf carts are part of a golf course. And if we're paying for them out of somewhere else, it's not being reflective here. So, and if it was, that blue line would be well below the green.
Well, Mr. Mayor, if I might address that for just a second, yes, we did take a one-time investment out of the Opportunity Fund last year to replace the golf cart fleet. We are anticipating, however, that from now on, you'll never have to do that again.
Well, that's good news.
Yeah, because we essentially are creating a depreciating fund, have created a depreciating fund that allows us to revolve that investment after the useful life of that fleet has expired. So in 7 years, 8 years, or whatever,
It'll replace itself.
we will have saved enough money from the operations of the fund to replace that fleet. So from now on,
That's certainly worth the
we'll
subsidy.
never have to do that again.
That's great news. And I wasn't aware of that. So that makes me feel much better.
Good.
Thank you for that.
The building, different story.
Right.
Replacing all the irrigation at the golf course, different story. Replacing the pond at the golf course, much different story. But when it comes to a lot of those capital things that help the facility run, we're trying to be better. Fort Casper. There's a lot of space between the blue line and the green line in this one, right? When we're hitting the green line, we're actually making a little money. When we're hitting the red line, we're actually achieving your goal of where we ought to be. You'll notice that your goal so far has been to receive 20%, recover 20% of the cost to make this operation work. So we're hovering around that 20% goal. We're obviously a little bit below that for fiscal year '24, but we're dramatically below where it is that we would need to actually make some money at the fort.
And this is where I fought so absolutely hard to get that wind hinge or whatever he was gonna call that out there to help get that up to where that would make money. With all the increased traffic, with all of the extra money in the gift shop, all of it. And sometimes, and I know that Fort Casper group is very loud, but they're not footing the bill like we are, like our taxpayers are. And at some point, we need to revisit a situation like that can help enhance that area. I mean, that's unacceptable. If this was any type of a business we were running at all, we'd be defunct. And that is one of our biggest drains, and it's, go ahead, but I just want to say, I'm so frustrated over this, because there are things we could have done and probably still can do to help this, but we're worried about a few people that we may irritate because there's something close to them. Well, if it's all for the greater good, I don't get it. I'll never get it. Go ahead.
Thanks, Bruce.
Sure.
I was curious, with our recent acquisition of the Isaac Walton area, is any of that, playing a role in our proposed budget for it? Is that a factor at all in this, or is that, a couple fiscal years out after we've made those improvements and, started to see, my assumption, or I guess the belief I came away with after us acquiring that was there'd be some synergy there and we could start boosting some revenues over at the campground.
Mr. Mayor, Councilor, I like the way you're thinking, and I think that, over time, when we have met our obligations to the league, that, satisfies those requirements of that purchase and so on, we will have a real genuine opportunity to talk about the way in which we want to envision the synergy between the campground and the museum and all the open space that's there as well. Because that, in my opinion, combined, can become a really nice recreational area. You've got certainly a history observation on one end. You've got, a preserve on the other with camping facilities. I think our opportunities out there on that oxbow are actually, we got a lot of upside out there. We really can't dive into that until we get through the time constraints that agreement requires. But when you've got a profit center that comes into the mix, I think it does add some opportunity that we haven't been able to realize before.
What is the timeline?
Do you remember, Jolene? I think it's 5 years when we consider.
Okay. So it's not as long as I thought. Go ahead.
Actually, after 10 years.
After 10 years, okay.
10.
It's 5 years, and then at year 15, it's negotiable.
Okay, so 10 years thereabouts.
That's what I was wanting.
Oh, okay.
Thank you.
I just didn't want him to lose lose track. Okay, very good. Okay, sir.
So, I would tell you though, the good news is this fund is, or, this cost center, if you will, is not as big as some of our other enterprises from a recreational standpoint is concerned. This is wholly and completely resides in the general fund, the fort that is, and not necessarily set apart in its own individual enterprise, which is another thing we could consider when time and constraints permit. That might give us some opportunities that we just don't currently have with it being in the general fund. So that is a bit of a difference as it relates to that operation.
Well, before the press fillets me on this, I do want to be said, I never wanted to question or hurt the integrity of the museum itself. I was just trying to help find ways to get more people in the door, because that's how we're going to change that subsidy. Is the more people we get in the door, the more admissions paid, the more gift shop stuff bought. And I just felt like that was a really good avenue to kind of divert people into there. So anyway, the council at the time saw it differently, which is fine. I'm just saying, I don't think we should ever lose sight of something like that to help subsidize us to get more people to utilize and to go see it.
Enjoy the treasure that it is.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
The good news too, Mr. Mayor, is that, unlike a lot of these operations, we've got a really active association, that you kind of referenced that does help from the standpoint of trying to generate grants and other partnerships that help us to get through some of the project lists that we try to do from time to time. But without a doubt, that gap is probably the biggest that you'll see in all of these. Okay. Moving on then to the other recreational enterprises, the ice arena. We talked a lot about the ice arena in the last several months. We have suggested to you that with more ice to sell, we can hover more closely with respect to this line here than it is where you've allowed us to operate currently. This is your goal right here. And as you can tell, we're, getting close to accomplishing your goal, albeit with some disparity here. This fund does represent some things that we would like to try by way of implementation, some of which we've talked to you about already. We'd like to get more firm direction from you here before the summer's over to hopefully not only get this blue line above here, but hovering somewhere in this neighborhood. Optimistically, right? Very optimistically. But nonetheless, we got to try things different than what we're doing now. And I certainly think if that capital project gets the lift that some say it will, I really do believe having more ice to sell, it's very realistic that we can be here based on the studies that we've conducted on your behalf.
Well, we just attracted a semi-pro team.
Yeah.
To Casper, and so, how they're gonna get ice time when we're already limited to ice time, we have kids practicing until 11 o'clock at night, it's gonna be tough, so I think it's certainly a necessity at some point if we're ever gonna get there to have the other piece.
Absolutely. And the good news is, they are aware of our ice constraints and they're willing to work with us and buy what's available and help this blue line improve even beyond what you're seeing right now.
And I know we have a group out there, a private group, that is working extremely hard to come up with some money to help get this other sheet of ice.
You're absolutely right. Absolutely right. Working really hard. Hogadon is actually kind of a success story for this year. And Zalima can talk in much greater detail than I can. But without a doubt, when you've got a good snow year, Streets doesn't view it the same way. Good things happen at Hogadon, right? And that road's open, good things happen at Hogadon. And that's certainly demonstrated with regard to what you're seeing right now. We've had a couple good snow years. We've had a lot of excitement with respect to night skiing. We've also had a lot of excitement with regard to summer use of the lodge. And I think that represents a lot of upside for this fund here as well. So thank you for your support in venturing out in those areas, because right now it appears to be paying some dividend, and I think would be at least in part responsible for what we're seeing here. Good snow will, always be a factor in terms of how Hogadon does or doesn't do, without a doubt. But when we've got some other things that are working in our favor, that it helps. It all helps. And we want to continue those things.
White snow covers up a lot of things.
Yeah.
Zulema, could you speak to the night skiing and the effect it's had on the bottom line? And if you think that'll continue, I know it was a pilot program for a specific amount of time. Is that something that we're going to continue?
Mayor, councilors, so I would have to look in my book to get you some exact numbers, but certainly night skiing has seen increased revenues. Last season was the first season. We just wrapped up our second season. We have seen increased visitorship. There's growing enthusiasm and excitement about night skiing. Should we be successful at getting the outdoor rec grant that we applied for to light Dreadnought, there's a ton of potential there in terms of partnerships with schools and being able to do more racing at night, and in terms of just bringing skiers to the area, because Dreadnought is really one of the favorite runs of the area. So yeah, absolutely. In terms of the pilot program, we are still in a period where the original donors that constructed the project are offering a backstop. So should we ever get into a position where Hogadon is losing money because of night skiing, they would make us whole. We don't anticipate that that's going to be the case, but we do have that protection for a little bit longer.
Cool, thank you, Kyle.
Thanks, Bruce. Thanks, Zulema. I thought that guaranteed backstop was only for the first 3 years. Are we through our second of 3 years?
Correct.
So do we only have 1 more year guarantee, or have they extended their willingness to help?
Mayor, Councilor, honestly, we haven't re-engaged in discussions about extension, just because we're not really anticipating a need for that at this point. As of right now, it's just 1 year remaining.
Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Sir?
Thank you. So, Mr. Mayor, I'm real optimistic about what Hogadon could look like for us, and I think with a couple implementations, like along the lines of what Zulema recommended or suggested or talked about, I think we need to focus on pushing that red line into that green line so that that goal is consistent with actually making money up.
And I believe this very council gave some capital improvement money to fix a couple of the issues that were up there, did we not?
The kitchen or the bar.
Yeah, the bar and the kitchen and did some concrete living.
Foundation.
Some things there, yeah. So,
Yep.
Okay, good.
And that work is imminent.
It's what?
Imminent, very
good.
imminent. Yeah, it's
Good.
about to happen.
Good.
All right, moving on. The Rec Center Aquatics. The Rec Center actually has a little bit of a different spin on it this year. You're going to see here in just a moment a new enterprise that we created with your blessing as it relates to segregating sports and athletics into its own fund so that we can more closely monitor those costs and better leverage the revenues that historically have not been available to the city of Casper. And so now that those relationships have changed and that revenue is due to the city directly, it is appropriate that we have this fund established so that we can understand our expenses better and align our revenues more appropriately. You're gonna see that here in a second. The recreation center was one of those places where those costs were previously accounted for, there and in the parks, part of the general fund. Nonetheless, the rec center still will be one of those enterprises that will likely have quite a bit of distance between what our goals are, what our performance is, and where it is that we actually make money. Rec centers that are city-owned just do not have that propensity, unfortunately. And so, generally speaking, direct distribution will come in to help make up that difference, as we saw earlier in the figure that was there. I think it was in the neighborhood of 400,000 or something like that, right? So the rec center is one of those that is a tough nut to crack. Now, without a doubt, we tried to be real creative. We got some other suggestions we'd like to have you entertain here in the next couple months that we think will be helpful to consider. But when it comes to, unique services and so forth that the rec center provides that would, be the panacea to get us across this divide, I'm not sure we're gonna have that silver bullet for you. So be aware, this is probably gonna be one of our long-standing subsidy concerns for quite some time to come. Aquatics is a lot the same way, particularly when you've got the investment that you do in the broad expanse of pools available to the public in our community. We're always going to have this chasm as well. You can only charge so much in terms of lessons, in terms of entry fees into the bodies of water. In some cases, we don't even charge entry fees in one of our pools, as you're all aware. Our profit centers are, our revenue centers, I should say, are fairly limited. The capital is expensive and will always be. We're likely going to suffer a gap here for the long term. The good news is, however, council has given us some relief as it relates to those investments that 1 Cent has made over the years. That too has been a long-term partnership that the public seems to be supportive of and requests every time we survey the community. So without a doubt, without that investment, we would have quite a bit of a struggle maintaining even this gap that you see here.
Kyle?
Yeah, thanks. Carter and Zulima, if I remember right, it was $300,000 a year from 1 Cent. 16. Do you recall what we allocated for this next cycle? Did we maintain that, or did we?
We did maintain the total investments 1.3 over the 4 years.
4 years.
Thank you.
Zulima, when you came to us with, and we were doing the graph and you'd showed us some things that you were gonna do to help start trying to help with these subsidies. Is that what's causing that spike, between, in 23 there on the blue line with the rec center? Is that a correlation to some of the new programming?
Mayor, so some of that actual FY '23, I think, is related to a grant that we were able to get from the Department of Family Services. And so we're making some investments, have improved some programming. We recently opened our new fitness room with spin bicycles and some different programming that we've created. So yes, implementing the things that I shared with you in our business plans, and we will actually be bringing forward business plans for formal approval very shortly, but implementing some of those strategies that we discussed with you and got your blessing on has definitely helped, I think, in the performance of all of these funds.
Good. Sir?
Thanks, Bruce. Sorry, I was thinking of other things. You might have just explained this. But so these proposed budgets for FY '24 include the advertising, the expansion of concession, and some of those other things we've discussed?
Mayor, Councilor, yes, they do. Although, as the city manager alluded to earlier, we've not had revenue, to try to improve the appearance of the performance of the fund. All of these are very conservative, attainable, realistic estimates that we believe we can get to, and maybe even surpass if we are truly successful in some of the strategies we're implementing.
Thank you, Zulima. Sir?
All right. Yeah, so here is at Sports and Athletics Fund. This is the first year, the first full budget year that this fund will be in place. And frankly, I'm excited for the prospects that this fund represents because this is primarily a programming fund that you get to control what those fees are in order for folks to pay to play. Previously, to remind you, we have not had access to those revenues in the past. I don't understand why. I don't understand why that relationship lasted as long as it did. But now that we're outside of that relationship, we get to realize those revenues. And currently, we're estimating a very, very conservative approach as it relates to our first year of operation in this paradigm. My plan and Zelena's plan is to give you a graduated approach that gets us closer to, covering our true costs of operating this area versus where we've been historically. And frankly, we've probably been lower than here over history, throughout history. So believe it or not, this actually represents an improvement, even though it's a lot smaller of an improvement than I want to see and that I'm excited to bring to you in terms of, say, a 5-year plan that improves this over time. That way we can kind of build, what it is that we need gradually instead of trying to do a balloon payment, so to speak.
Would you mind reminding us where that revenue was going, that we're now going to be able to capture?
Absolutely. Do you want to cover that, Zelina, if you don't mind?
Mayor, Councilor, so historically, we have had a longstanding relationship with CRLA, the Casper Rec League Association. This was a relationship that started in the 80s and has persisted this long. And so the way that program was structured was that all of the fees that people paid to participate in league sports were paid directly to CRLA. CRLA would use those dollars to pay officials, for umpires, for all the officials for all the league sports. And then they would also reimburse the city for gym time and for athletic field time, say for softball leagues. The problem with that model is that the last time rates were adjusted were like in 2011, I believe, in terms of how much we were charging for rental of those facilities. As well as the fact that even though Paul Zawada and his team were doing 95% of the work in coordinating league sports and all of the tournaments, our staff time was not being reimbursed at all. And so we have restructured that relationship with CRLA. They will remain an advisory body for the city. They will help come up with the rule books and assist with the tournaments and keeping with advising us on the structure of league sports. But we will take over the financial arm of the operation, realize those revenues ourselves, pay the officials, and thankfully CRLA has agreed to stay on and help us in terms of contract work to staff large tournaments that we may struggle to staff on our own. But we really believe that the new structure of the relationship will be mutually beneficial to both groups.
Cool. Thank you.
So,
sir.
Does this include soccer fields and Crossroads and Field of Dreams and Mike Lansing and George Tanny and basically all of that? I see that's a yes, okay.
So Mayor, Councilor, this is kind of an interesting culmination of a lot of different operations that were sort of spread out throughout the city. So all of the athletic field maintenance function has historically been in parks, which of course is 100% general fund. So with this fund, we moved the parks or the athletics maintenance operations into the fund with the idea that lease revenue from those leaseholders, soccer, baseball, those kind of places, as well as the fees that are paid for league sports will help then to subsidize the maintenance of the athletic fields, which is so expensive. And that's kind of the hope here, that we will be able to set the rates for people to play and to rent the facilities to where, we're in a much better position than we are now and have been historically.
And Mr. Mayor, I might add, goes a long way in terms of supporting a general fund operation that historically has not had any support.
Yeah.
So the reality is this is a general fund sustainability measure as well, which I am very, very grateful. We are finally moving in this direction. This probably should have been done a decade ago as well.
As a follow-up, are we still keeping the fields on 13th Street? Okay. A good nod, yeah, that's all I
Yes,
cared
sir.
about.
So
Okay.
that field at 13th and Sycamore is currently being utilized by fast pitch softball.
I knew it had been, I'd heard, gonna close it, no, we aren't, now we're gonna give it to girls fast pitch, now we're gonna, so we're keeping it and it.
That user group is very enthusiastic and excited to grow their program, so absolutely.
Very good.
Yep, absolutely. So this represents a huge opportunity area, the tale of which we have more to discuss with all of you, okay? All right. Well, that really takes us through subsidies, and the reality is through the bulk of what it is that I wanted to visit with you tonight about. There definitely is more detail in the narrative. A lot of what you heard tonight is captured in the narrative, but between what you see in the narrative and what you see in your budget books, you're certainly going to glean a lot more detail and potentially questions that you would want to have entertained at some point. So while we may be close to finished with regard to what it is we need to talk to you about as it relates to the fiscal year 24 budget, we have until June to actually pass the budget on a formal basis. And so in a lot of ways, this is the beginning of your formal deliberation process that you go through, culminating in the passage of the budget in the third Tuesday in June, which is our statutory requirement. That's kind of our day X, if you will, if you've been following that broader national conversation. Day X. Anybody? No? Day X, all right. Deficit
You really
ceiling.
are having a good time with this whole thing, aren't you?
Yeah, it's all right. Okay, no problem.
Andrew didn't
All right.
You concur, Mr. Beamer, with this day X thing he's talking about?
You can say whatever you want.
I appreciate his sense of humor.
Is that what that was?
No, the day X. Gosh. Google deficit ceiling.
Debt ceiling, got it.
Debt ceiling, yeah, please do.
No.
A lot of negotiations happening. Thankfully, we don't have that going on. All right, well, as far as thoughts for the future are concerned, we really need to focus on this over the next year, probably over the next 2 years. Some highlights, of course, the Casper Business Center for $10 million. I like to hear the chief groan when I say that. Monitoring the development of Amendment A and hopefully our aggressive use of that feature now that it's passed. We've already given you a little bit of a preview that implementing some subsidy suggestions are forthcoming, imminent, and you know, will likely be a little bit of a heavy lift. We've got some other things we want to talk to you about as far as further sustainability is concerned, very much in concert with your goal in that regard, and so we want to track that real closely and try to do what we said we would do in our council goal setting session earlier this year. And I will tell you too, we've got a number of things we need to do here over the next year to 2 years in certain areas of our operation as well, because we want to keep the best and the brightest and find those folks as often as we can. Higher up, every time we have that opportunity.
We also have some opportunities for some federal funding along the way.
Yep.
With stormwater, with the police department. I know that I've been in touch with Mrs. Hageman's people, and I know she's fighting for us on the federal level. So we may get some reprieves along the way. That remains to be seen, but we might have some funds coming our way to help with stormwater and especially the police department. So
absolutely.
So one can keep his fingers crossed, certainly.
Absolutely. This is not meant to be an exhaustive list of all the things we need to accomplish.
Right.
You know, but some of the broader highlights that are on our horizon without a doubt.
I will say, and I'm sure the entire council concurs, that we appreciate anytime you can bring us a balanced budget. We appreciate the work on behalf of the staff because we know I know Pete hasn't slept for probably 3 weeks. And there's a lot of hard work that goes into these. Like you said, every number gets washed and these department heads work their tails off. And I hope you all understand that we appreciate every one of you. We understand the taxing jobs that you go through, and it's so much appreciated because it makes our job so much easier. So thank you all. Andrew, probably won't get to thank you ever again since you're riding off into the sunset, but we sure appreciate our department heads and you, Carter, for the work that you folks do. Absolutely.
Thank you. And that's $197 million in a nutshell.
Boom.
Good job, Carter.
Yeah.
And does Pete need another tube of Ben Gay for his finger muscles?
Everybody assumes I do the whole thing.
No, nobody assumes that, Pete. Nobody assumes you do it all. Just most of it. Well, with that, you have anything else, sir?
Nope, other than to say I look forward to visiting you tomorrow night. If there's any homework we need to do in between now and the time we get together again, now's the time to let me know, or, shoot me an email, we'll try to answer.
Or we could certainly bring those concerns tomorrow night too. Don't forget, we do have a bit of a full slate tomorrow, with a lot of items to cover from MRG2 to, there's a lot of things on the docket. Everyone will be here except for Steve. We will meet here at 4:30, and that will be our last meeting for the next year and a half or so in this building. For now on, leadership meetings will take place over at Casper Business Center, up at Casper's office, in Carter's office. And then all our work sessions and meetings for now on, including work sessions, will be at the Lyric, because we are not here next Tuesday. So we'll see you all tomorrow night at 4:30. Anybody, do we need to do count around the table? Let's do that. Mr. Bond?
I'll be zooming, I'll be on Teams tomorrow night, so
You will be here, it'll just be via Teams?
I'll just be via Teams,
Okay,
yeah.
thank you. Fleur, were you aware of that? Okay.
Yeah.
Do you have anything else for, no? Okay, Mr. Cathy?
It was brought up, are we putting up anything in the downtown area where we've got the banners and stuff? Are we putting up any kind of like red, white, and blue or whatever for 4th of July?
Mr. Mayor, Councilor, we do have things that we've used in the past that resemble the flag, that we have posted on those standards around the downtown.
You know where I'm...
I do.
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep. And so unless something is different than I understand right now, we will carry that forward this year as well.
Very good.
Anything else, Steve?
Oh, CPU meeting tomorrow morning has been canceled because the out of area water request has been postponed, therefore there's nothing to do.
Before I forget, will you get me percentages on the differences in, was that you, Tracy, on the, for the property?
I actually have it.
Okay, I'll get it from you here in just a second then. Randy?
My public health was postponed until next month, so I didn't have anything.
Okay. Amber? My future Taiwanese traveler? Lucky. So jelly.
It's not next meeting, by the way, I'll be here for one more and then gone after that.
So you'll be here for the June 4th? Okay.
I got to attend the North Platte Park #2 workshop with MPO and the consultant that hired to do that master plan in that area up near the Fort Wyoming Center and the forthcoming Wyoa Sports Ranch. Really productive session. We had 3 hours, I think, where we got to just sit with some folks from city staff and from the consultant's office and advanced Casper and really start to generate some ideas in advance of public sessions that will be coming up for folks from the public to weigh in on that project as well. And then I attended the LGBTQ advisory committee meeting on Friday. Not anything too significant to report there other than they'll be in attendance for Pride next month. And I think that's all I have.
Cool. Well, thank you. Lisa?
I attended Visit Casper this morning, and So I just kind of wanted to give a report on the visitors in Wyoming. So in 2022, Wyoming had 7.5 million visitors, with Natrona County getting about 746,000. So the state, they spent approximately 4.5 billion in goods and services throughout the state.
Wow.
So, but these numbers were a little bit down from 2021, and so that was a 8.5% decrease. So at the end of the day, I still think that these are fairly impressive numbers. So tourism is very alive and well. And then Visit Casper is launching a new marketing co-op. This program is tourism driving businesses in Natrona County trying to bring in tourism. So it's kind of like a contest. You apply, and the winner will receive $2,500 in marketing. And
Nice.
so the applications are due by March 31st. So if anybody is interested in
May 31st?
May,
You said March.
I truly am still in.
I just didn't know if they were, I didn't know if it was going on for a whole
I can't
year
even
or.
believe it's May, so I am, it is May 31st, and the winners will be selected mid-June. And so the applications are online at Visit Casper. And then also, I would just like to mention Seth Hollier had sent an email, and I do think that we should pursue looking at setting up a committee and for the youth, and then he's got this group of people that may be willing to pay for studies for our youth, and so for the non-discrimination. And in the committee, I strongly suggest we ask Seth if he would like to also be a part of this committee.
Okay. Anything else?
That is it.
All right, well, thank you. Jenna,
Nope, nothing
nothing?
that I can think of at the moment.
Mr. G?
Always.
I like it.
Had a Metro Animal Task Force meeting last Wednesday. We are trying to get all of Casper and our adjacent municipalities on the same fee and fine rate schedule to create uniformity. We charge all different fees and fines as it relates to animal ordinances, so we're trying to create uniformity because we're all close together. It's difficult once you cross jurisdictional lines to keep all those things straight, so I believe Mills, Barnett, and Evansville liaisons from that board are all going back to their respective groups to try to move in that direction. We also, I know Councilor Pollack and I had received lots of correspondence in the past from folks passionate about this issue, and so I tried to package all those communications and contacts up and disseminate it to the group so that we can explore getting in some additional funding for trap, spay, neuter programs, or potentially looking at rebuilding the shelter at some point in the future. So just trying to all work together with our adjacent municipalities as far as that goes. Advanced Casper had a nice social last Wednesday night, so I got to go there and talk to people about MRG funding for the airport to keep Sky West, about 1 cent funding, and a lot of other stuff that coalition of folks was interested in. Had a Casper Housing Authority board meeting last Thursday. Liz joined us. She's around here somewhere. Hey, Liz. Provided updates mostly in relation to the sale of North Casper School to Wyoming Food for Thought, because that was Casper Housing Authority originally bought it, and then they were selling to Wyoming Food for Thought, so got some updates on that, as well as updates on the CDBG funding as it relates to both those projects. It's been quite a feat to get those funds released, which is kind of a shame considering there's some pretty hefty carrying costs to carry both of those buildings, and they haven't been able to put a shovel in the ground yet. So we got to hear from Mark, who's our Wyoming State Director at HUD, and he provided some updates on the public housing portion of Casper Housing Authority's responsibility, as well as informed the board that our Casper Housing Authority is very highly regarded by HUD, among other things. But he also made mention of the fact, I think I mentioned it before, that our housing authority had the highest utilization of emergency housing vouchers in the entire country when we were kind of at peak COVID. So he made mention of that again. Had Funky Junk over the weekend. Always an awesome community event in the neighborhood. I saw Amber working her butt off there, so had great weather. It was a really good event. I sat in on travel and tourism with Lisa today. We do have the $25,000 community promotions funding that we had allocated. We are meeting next week to go over all of those grants and distribute that funding. So we have all the applications. It's a big old, Amanda dropped off a, geez, it's a big old ledger, pretty much like the budget, so.
7.
Yeah, gonna have to
All for 25 grand, huh?
Yeah, it's a lot of work, so I haven't quite got to that yet. The budget consumed all my time, but got some homework over the weekend. Also, Visit Casper had their annual breakfast a couple weeks ago. I didn't mention it, but that crowd was very interested to hear from Jessica Hastings at YO Sports Ranch about their project. Somebody correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe Jessica said at that event that they were looking to break ground in June and they're looking to open around spring in 2025. So very exciting, they're gonna start working on that, and that's all I got. Thanks.
Thank you, sir.
That's it?
That's it.
Vice Mayor?
Homeless initiatives meeting tomorrow.
That's it?
That's it.
Well,
Sweet, it's been a long night.
I like it. I'll be quick. Today I attended the ceremony for Officer Tiffany Elhart. Did I say that right? She was the 2022 Law Officer of the Year for the Casper Police Department. And I think a couple of the Legion and VFW presented her with that award. Anyway, that was cool to see. We had a terrible accident downtown last night in the early morning hours. Some folks that were under investigation for some heinous crimes got into a speed chase with our police officers downtown, hitting speeds of 100 miles an hour. Tack strips were deployed. One of them is dead. I think two of the other ones are injured. No one else was injured in the crash other than the perpetrators themselves. So kudos to our law enforcement officers, our police department. We have such a kick-ass department here, and I am so proud of them. So, and it's always good to acknowledge them when they do great work. Youth Commission, is that something we can put on a future agenda because we had talked about possibly going back and looking at some age stuff in the discrimination ordinance. We have promised to do that at some point, so I'd like to make sure we get that on a future agenda. And we could form that committee and possibly ask Seth to join and anyone else from the council, and so we can explore some options there. I did meet with him last week in my office, and I was kind of at a loss because I thought there were certain protections for youth in our community, and there are, but I think they're looking for a little more, so it's certainly worth exploring. So if we can get that on an agenda, and bless the buses for transit and link. Got to shoot them with a high-powered gun, even though somebody tried to shoot me with a tiny little gun and I had a rocket. So if you ever want to get in a fight, go with Jenna, because she brings knives to gunfights. She's that kind of girl. She came after me with this tiny little gun and I just gave it to her. I did. I couldn't help it. Anyway, that's always fun to do. And they had cookies and good stuff. So that's all I have. See you tomorrow night at 4:30. And dinner will be served again. Have a great night. And